welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. We have with us here today a distinguished scientist. His name is, well, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Jess Brewer.
Jess Brewer. Jess Brewer is a Google Scholar, simply lists him as Professor Emeritus at the Department of Physics and Astronomy at University of British Columbia, but that is really just not saying nearly enough. That is that's how you end up running into him, I'm sure. But he has a PhD in high energy physics from 1972 at the University of California, Berkeley. He did his postdoctoral fellowships at the Lorentz Berkeley Laboratory, the University of Arizona, working at Berkeley, and the Department of Chemistry at the University of British Columbia, working at the TRIUMF. That's TRIUMF. It's a acronym that I do not know what it means, and I'm sure he'll explain it to you. At the TRIUMF Accelerator Laboratory in Vancouver. So in 1977, he was appointed as the assistant professor in UBC's physics department, and joined the superconductivity program of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research in 1988. So I'm actually interested in asking him a little bit about superconductivity. Hopefully he'll meander into that a little bit for us today as well. Professionally, he was a developer of the methodology and the facilities for muon spin rotation, relaxation, resonance. That's USR, the little mu symbol SR. And in 2011, he retired and was granted the emeritus status at UBC. He is still active in research, apparently, primarily at the CMMS facility of TRIUMF in Vancouver. I didn't know that. In Canada, where he promotes muon spin rotation, relaxation, resonance as a versatile and powerful tool for studying local magnetic fields in solids and the behavior of hydrogen isotopes in matter. His areas of research have been muons and superconductors, muonium. I didn't even know that existed. Muonium in superconductors, magnetic polarons, muon, and muon physics generally. So while he's received various accolades like UBC's Professor of the Year and Lifetime Achievement Award from the ISMS, he's happiest about the Brockhouse Medal from the Canadian Association of Physicists, the Yamazaki, I hope I pronounced that right, the Yamazaki Prize from ISMS, that's the International Society for MUSR Spectroscopy, and that was in 2011. And he also was very happy about the UBC Killam? Is it the Killam? Research Prize in 1996. So, however, he says he gets his main personal satisfaction from fighting against the commodification of science. So that's the science and technology, and of course also from the attacks of deconstructionist sociologists who have supplanted religionists as the enemies of Popperian science. So we're talking about a hard physics fellow here. He's going to be a hard nut to crack if I want to try to convince him that steampunk is a valuable thing. So personally, I highly recommend his 2007 cyberpunk short story published in the journal Nature Physics called "Giving Up Meat." I was blown away. I just read that, I think, yesterday. Oh my God, that was so great. I didn't realize that in 2007 he put together this story, and it was published in Nature Physics. It's so cool. But from the pre-interview questions, it's obvious that Jess is strongly influenced by the pursuit of knowledge and for the sake of learning about the universe instead of some direct profit motive, which he finds too often interferes and corrupts that crucial process. And I could not agree more. Knowledge for knowledge's sake and instead of knowledge for profit's sake there's so many factors involved. And so I asked him a few questions in a pre-interview, sent him a couple of questions. And so I'm going to read off the questions I sent to him, a couple of them anyway, and see if we can't get a little conversation going about him, so we can learn a little bit more about we've already learned all of his accolades. Obviously, a guy who really knows his stuff, but let's get to know him a little bit personally. So in one of my questions, I say this series is going to focus on problems in and solutions to the history of physics. So I would like to address the human element of science. What do you feel is the biggest current technical issue in physics? And what do you believe are the largest social hurdles for physics and the greater scientific community? And he answered, there's a bunch of good candidates, obviously, but I think the biggest is that there's too much of it. So would you mind elaborating for us?
Let's see. I didn't say anything before. Let's see.
You said a few things before, but I omitted some of the questions because they seemed like you weren't particularly interested in this thing or that thing. So there was, and I was hoping that you could kind of riff off of your answers there. So, no pressure.
Stock answer, basically. I mean, the problem is that when I was an undergraduate, it was actually feasible for a single human to learn all about a given branch of physics.
Yeah.
And by the time I was a graduate student, which was only a few years later, that was starting to get a little bit tricky. And someone calculated that if the growth rate of PhysRev letters and physical reviews continued at the way it had been indefinitely, within 100 years, the stack of PhysRev would be going away at the speed of light. And
so just the papers would just be stacking up. At a certain point, they would have to like cut it in half because you couldn't, they wouldn't be able to grow the stack fast enough. Right. That's hilarious.
So, I mean, now, of course, the internet has solved that problem, but it doesn't solve the problem of the capacity of the human mind and brain to absorb and process that amount of information.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, we may be able to kick the can down the road a little bit if we get AI support, if we get enhanced with AIs in our brain. But basically, there's a lot of science now. There's many times more science information, not even counting the garbage, right?
Right. Information. The good useful stuff
that than there was, 50 years ago.
Yeah. So basically what the issue then, if I were to kind of speculate, and because this is something I've seen also, is that you end up having these silos that can't communicate with each other. In other words, like if you spend your time as a professional, you're supposed to be trying to learn as much as you can, but you can only learn as a human being so much. And so then because there's so much information, even in a subfield, you end up not being able to get the information available in the other fields that may add to or somehow color your little subfield. And so you end up having these little growths of information. And I think I've specifically, that's, I love science, which is why I criticize it. There's I think that has kind of been the impetus of science for the longest time, is to try to criticize itself. And so, I've always wanted to be part of that process. And I think a lot of viewers might also be, interested in kind of, participating in science. So, there's a lot of people out there who like to, get in their garage and make things. And so I kind of feel the same way, but that's kind of, as I've looked into it, there seems to be silos of knowledge where people, they literally as a human being can't learn enough. In other words, there really is just too much information, and it's good, valuable, true, necessary information that you just can't. There's no way to learn it all, and that's something that I've been talking with a group of friends and scholars about. The ideas of trying. How do you communicate cross discipline between biologists and physicists and when even within one of those fields, there's multiple subfields that are too voluminous for them to even, really communicate within the subfields, no less between whole, fields. So I haven't really known of any really good way to solve that issue other than professionalizing science communication. In other words, science communication, you've got all these various journalists who participate in science communication, and a lot of them do a very good job without any kind of regulation and no formalized training. But I really think that that because of this problem, I think science communication, which basically tries to take the big picture, most important parts of various fields and drill down just enough to give a picture that can unfold in the mind of the person listening, that can basically enhance or at least bring up specific curiosities in the minds of other scientists to allow a little more communication between the fields. And so I guess what I'm saying is that there's a lot of people complain about science communicators. There's a lot of complaints and a lot of legitimate complaints about science communicators. But at the same time, I think it's one of those things like complaining about the police, that I think that, if you pay those people more, you make it more professional, then you can be a little more selective and you can have more controls on it. And so that's kind of been, sort of, I don't know, that's been my idea. I don't know. It just came up. And so I figured what do you think? You think that's something that could help?
Of course. I mean, what I would like to see is I'd like to see more professional scientists spending more of their time, communicating their work to the media and people that are not specialists in their fields, and people that are just curious.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem with separating the task off to science journalists is that science journalists are going to have to try to find a way to make it sound cool. Okay? Because their readers or listeners or watchers or whatever are really they're only gonna tune in if it's cool, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Sometimes cool is not right.
That's absolutely true.
It's so tempting to just say something, people have found a way to go faster than light.
Right? Yeah, I know.
And I get all kinds of questions on Quora, or used to before Quora got ruined.
Yeah, that was unfortunate.
I got a lot of questions about things that people had read in various science news magazines that were, wrong.
Well, what I specifically mean, though, is in other words, like, keep the journalists, but actually have communicators where their job is to be a type of scientist, but basically a meta scientist. In other words, where their job is to learn enough about lots of different fields instead of being a specialist, that their job is literally to be a generalist, to communicate not primarily to the wider audience, but to communicate to scientists. In other words, like where.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nature is pretty good about that. Nature, I found, is a decent magazine for, trying to, and Science also. It's also a good magazine for spreading it around. That's the idea. Nobody's ever going to know everything. And,
that's true.
So the fun part of science is when you're reading about something in one field and you say, hey, I could do that. I could use that for my field. Or you got something from your field and you're listening to somebody talk about their problem and you say, hey, I got an idea how you might be able to solve that.
Yeah, I know. I've especially enjoyed watching biologists and physicists interact in a group that I've been chatting with for some time. It's really neat to see, because they're very different. They're very detailed sciences with a tremendous amount of complex things going on in each of them. But the way that they approach the problems are very different, and so it's one of those things that I feel I've been watching people sort of kind of try to merge the two approaches a little bit, and it's really neat to watch that kind of occur.
Well, there is an academic field called biophysics. For a couple of years, I taught a course that was actually designed by a colleague of mine that asked me to teach it when he retired, called what the hell was it called?
Well, I only slept 4 hours last night. I tossed and turned for 4 hours last night, so you'll have to excuse me, as I'll probably be drawing a blank on a few things every once in a while as well.
It was basically the physics of zoology, animal physics, which is actually fascinating subject, and that was a little bit different from biophysics, because most of biophysics is people trying to figure out DNA and stuff like that.
Right.
But I don't know, just, there's a lot of interesting things in the world.
Yeah, I know. And when you have a thirst for knowledge, sometimes it seems like you can never get enough. It's like, how do I get it all in here? And it just
you
can't.
Right. And that's what I was referring to before. I mean, the problem is that there's just so much that is known that it's fragmented into specializations. I mean, I'm very privileged. Well, I'm very privileged for a number of reasons, but I was particularly lucky that I picked a topic for my dissertation that had so little volume of material written about it that it was actually feasible for me to read everything that had ever been written and understand it and to comment on it and to try to make improvements and so on. That became, in my own field, that became completely inconceivable within about 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And now I barely am able to sort of scan the literature in MUSR.
I know. It's
and there's a whole bunch of people who don't know anything about what other people in this field are doing.
So with that in mind, let's move on to the next question that I had asked you, which is, so it's like, sometimes, people like to criticize science, but they just really don't realize how hard people work in these fields. And it's still, there's this fundamental limit to how much a person can know. There's a fundamental limit. And so that's going to always end up with, there's always going to be problems. And people just, they're too perfectionist about things. Science can't be this perfect. It's not a religion. We can't treat it like a religion. It's never going to be this perfect thing. And so even as we criticize it, a criticism is not something that is a binary. It's not it's a part of a process. So in that vein, one of the next questions I asked you was with the various crises of replication and the engines of big pharma and funding and fundamental problems with models in physics, we seem to be at a difficult crossroads for trust in the institutions that were so crucial to the rise of technological society. And what is your personal philosophy and observations about the interplay of orthodoxy, bias, personal bias, consensus, authority systems, and all of that in the scientific pursuit of knowledge? And then you mentioned the Schoen affair and bring up questions that revolve around the Etvos. I've always pronounced it that way, and it's probably wrong.
I think it's pronounced Etvish, but I'm not sure.
Okay, yes, I knew that's like, that seems like I'm doing that wrong. So so what did you had said there that basically these problems of trust, that there was a can you give us some insight specifically on what was going on with the Schoen affair and the Etvos experiment that you had mentioned in the pre-interview?
Well, Schoen was claiming to do, and a bunch of people at Bell Labs that were on his papers with him also put their names on it, so they also were involved in this.
Also ended up with egg on their face, apparently.
Yep. And some of them didn't really deserve it, except that they were just too credulous, I guess. I believe that what happened was that Schoen had this conviction that if you could figure out a way to apply a strong enough electric field to various materials, that they would exhibit all kinds of bizarre and exciting behavior, and that the problem was to try to apply a huge field gradient or a huge potential difference across a thin film without it breaking down. So he claimed that he had. and he showed all these wonderful effects that he was convinced would happen if you could. And in a sense, I think he was gambling that people would be so excited by it, they'd all run out and try to replicate these results. And in fact, everybody did. They did. A whole bunch of people went out and tried to replicate the results and couldn't. And they said, boy, he must be really good at that. I don't know how he did it, right? Well, the answer is he didn't, right?
Yeah.
So it was a gamble, right? Now, if somebody had managed to actually achieve what he claimed he had achieved, and someday maybe somebody will, okay? It may not be wrong. That's the really bizarre that he'd get a Nobel Prize and be famous, right? As the discoverer.
It's basically like he cheated on funding. He's like, I'll get other people to get funding to do lots of experiments.
Yeah. There's well, I don't think it was a funding issue. Bell Labs was pretty well stocked, but the Aether experiment. There's people who have questioned whether the Aether experiment is where you drop a ball in a vacuum and measure its acceleration and try to discern whether there could possibly be a difference between the gravitational mass and inertial mass, because you only get a constant acceleration in gravity if they're the same thing.
Yeah,
and he measured it to excruciating precision a long time ago.
Yeah, just incredible precision. Yeah,
people are saying, how did he do that? And the methods, the description of his experiment was, it's received some skepticism.
Yeah, and so basically,
it's probably a gamble, right? It was probably a gamble, and as far as we know at this point, it was a good gamble. He actually was right.
Yeah, theoretically. The thing is, that's one of those things where I think there's this dichotomy of you need to be able to move forward. That's like some of the things we've talked about, offline, is how, as a programmer, if you don't, it's hard to learn to use other people's code. And as a programmer today, you have got to use other people's code. There's all these libraries and things like that. And so there's this, I talk about one of the things that happened to me early in my career programming is I just get stuck because I wanted to learn everything underlying the code I was using. I wanted to go all the way down to the metal. And then I nearly got fired from my first job because I wasn't progressing. I was regressing down a rabbit hole instead of moving forward. And so that's one of those fundamental barriers that progress requires a level of faith. Progress requires that risk that you could have been wrong. And so understanding that that's part of the scientific process, that we move forward because we take our best guess and then we remember, hey, we could be wrong, could be, but we're going to continue moving forward. And that
we are always wrong.
Exactly. And
everything we think we know is an illusion. We do not know anything.
But I think it's like deep in our DNA, to be religious about every knowledge set that we have, everything. We want to it's the absolute truth. We want that feeling of certainty. And so sometimes whatever knowledge system that we start to capture, we like that's the truth. And I don't want, don't say nothing about it. So there's this natural thing. Say again?
That's religion, not science.
I know, exactly. But I feel like that's kind of a human thing. That's where that's part of, when science really became successful, it's when it started trying to eliminate our human biases and how much we are constantly putting things into to the way that we perceive science. And that's part of Popperism. You brought that up in the pre-interview that you're an experimentalist. You spent time, with the metal. You're down on the ground level, and so of course experimentalism, empirical science, and basically falsifying things. So that whole process that was really kind of a heart of science for a long time it's just a very important perspective, because instead of trying to believe something is true, you're trying to just get all the garbage of the things that we just kind of make up. You want to get all that out of the way. That's okay. Yeah, we're going to make this nonsense up and make that nonsense up, and just get that out of there. And then whatever's left, we can work with that, and so I really respect that. And we had a conversation about how there was, some people are like, oh, Popperism's passe, that's so last century, and I can see how that's a huge problem. But there were a couple of small, it really goes way too far. I totally agree with that there's kind of this problem of relativism in the idea of truth. In other words, that everybody's truth is basically the same, and like that's just not true. And probably, and here's where I'll want to try to go in a certain direction in this interview, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. And that there's where I try to talk about, what good is metaphysics then? What good is theory? What good is any of these things? When you just want to get down to the hard science, the real numbers, the real measurements, and and get rid of all the nonsense. Well, there's an issue of how you apply your formulas. How do you determine where you apply and how you apply things? And so the question of what value is theory, and especially if they have equivalent outcomes. I like to bring up this story where there are these people in Papua New Guinea who they pray to the fishing tree, and they go and they sing and pray to the spirit of the fishing tree, and you can watch it happen, and the fish come to the surface, they gather up their fish, and they go home. Now, so they have a theory that their ceremony for the fishing tree uses the spirit of the tree to bring them fish, and it is a testable hypothesis. And it is replicable, and you can go and watch them do it. But it turns out that part of this singing and praying and beating a root into the water is releasing a neurotoxin that is not harmful to humans, but is only harmful to the fish, so they can actually eat the fish without harm. And so the answer in a postmodernist perspective is that, well, their view is equal to yours, that it's a neurotoxin. They're completely equal because, well, here they have a hypothesis, they test their hypothesis, and it is replicated, and so therefore it's good science. And so what is the difference between these two things? What is one truth superior to the other or not? And in my opinion, of course there's a difference, because we can then take the idea that it's a neuroscience and apply our knowledge in a completely different fashion. We could create something that that it's a neurotoxin. I'm sorry, 4 hours of sleep. That we could apply the idea that it's a neurotoxin, and because it's not harmful to humans, perhaps it'll actually help as like for people with nerve pain and and issues like that perhaps it'll have some minor effect of dulling nerves instead of damaging them. There's these ways that we could use them. Now they could also extend their theory. They could take the root and burn it near bees. And it turns out that, things that are neurotoxic a lot of times are also insecticides. And so they may be able to gather honey, more food. In other words, they could actually kind of extend their theory that the spirit of the tree helps them. But if they go out there, and try to, get a herd of deer or whatever with their fishing tree, it's not going to work out. And so there is the extension of your theory because of how closely it matches reality. That is important. That is like it is the narrowing of the field of inquiry that is so important, because there is infinite things that you could test out. And so what makes a theory valuable, what makes one set of knowledge superior to another if they have the exact same outcome, is that one is more extensible than the other. One is more applicable. One somehow matches reality for a longer period of time than the other. And I think that would be my way of kind of refuting that postmodernist idea.
Well, I mean, you don't have to refute it for me. I don't buy any of that bullshit. But, there are, you're saying that some theories are better than others, right? And there are many reasons that a theory can be bad or good, right? Another reason to choose one theory over another. If you have two theories to explain the same thing, and one of them is much simpler than the other, and they both work equally well, I mean, it only makes sense to choose the simple one.
But how do you know you're not choosing the simpler one? It is simpler that it's the spirit of the fishing tree than some idea of some neurotoxin. What even is that? You have to have this whole idea of neurons and all these various complex things. Why not just simplify it down to the spirit of the tree? And
for the people in Papua New Guinea, that's probably a better theory, right? Because
it is exactly. There is
to your kids, you know.
Yeah. No there is a value within a context, and I agree. There is sort of a value within context, and that theory may be more valuable specifically to them in their context. But isn't there a context of matching reality that is outside of, your human element? In other words, isn't that theory still inferior when you choose, even though it works better for them? Isn't it still an inferior theory?
Well, I think so, because I'm sort of committed to pushing every theory until it breaks, right? That's the whole idea of science.
Mm-hmm. Well, see, I bring this up specifically because I frequently talk about, we've got these different interpretations of, quantum mechanics and things like that. And a lot of times they're like, well, if it comes out the same, what's the difference? And that is always my point. There is a difference. There is a difference of value in the ability to extend it, and there's a difference in the narrowness or wideness of the field of inquiry. Where you spend your time digging for gold in the future, where is it that you're searching, can be narrowed by a better theory. In other words, one that matches and goes along with reality better, narrows the area that you'll be searching in the future. And I think that is my primary argument for all these various things. So, anyhow, that was kind of a one area, but there was another thing that we can move right along to some of the other. Let me look at my notes here really quick. Okay, so we're talking about consensus and all of these different aspects of the human element in science. And I recently had an argument about whether knowledge requires consensus, is something that you said. And my position was that lasting knowledge does require consensus. Otherwise, it vanishes when the person that came up with the understanding dies. So this was, an interesting thing that you were talking about. And I was hoping that you could elaborate a little bit on consensus versus new science dichotomy, because consensus tends to try to keep they're kind of keepers of the faith, because it's, you're working on something, you're working on the faith, and you can't just keep switching off to other things. You have to take what you've been doing and continue to extend it as far as you can until it breaks. But there's always kind of in these complex things, there's a question of, has it broken or has it not? Has it broken sufficiently? So maybe you can kind of, tie in a little the crisis of confidence between science and the wider public, and this dichotomy of new science versus consensus, and sort of your take on that whole situation.
Well, it gets very complicated sometimes. I mean, you have to, if there aren't always competing theories for the same phenomena, but when there are competing theories, I mean, what other method could you have for choosing a winner than to basically have a big conference, get all the experts together and see who likes which theory better? I mean, it's a flawed method, but it's even to be able to talk to other scientists about the subject requires that you have a common language, and the common language embodies a set of theories, right, which have been arrived at by consensus. Used to be phlogiston was an important consideration,
right,
but not so much now. But there are some things for which consensus is more effective than others. How to put this exactly? For instance, one of the issues of our day is anthropic global climate change, and whether or not humans are responsible for all the changes in the weather.
Yep.
And I'd say at this point, you'd have to be pretty, pig-headed to try to hang on to your skepticism about it. But
Yep.
but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be skeptical about some things. So that you should retain your skepticism about any specific claim or measurement, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything, because it's a very sloppy subject. There are many things that are contributing to the greenhouse effect. There are many things that contribute to climate change other than the greenhouse effect. It's pretty clear to me, anyway, and certainly to most people, that our dumping of CO2 and methane into the atmosphere from all of our fossil fuel, activities is made a big contribution, and things are getting worse fast.
Yeah, absolutely. It's it's a big issue.
At the same time, I mean, our farming practices have also made a big contribution. We're killing our soil, and all the bio mass that used to be alive in the soil has now died and is being released as CO2. That's a huge effect.
Yeah. Oh man, now that we've started to understand the importance of the biological, the microbiomes, and all of the microbiomes in the soil and humans, and how much that impacts. I mean, finding out that there's this gut-brain connection where just the microbiome in your gut can dramatically alter your cognitive state through the various different vitamins and things. It's like, we had just 20, 30 years ago, we had no idea that it was that complex, that there was we just throw antibiotics at you and be like, you'll be fine. And now we're like, oh crap. Okay, we were screwing that up.
I heard somewhere that there's more neurons in your gut than there are in your head.
Yeah, I don't know how true that is. I think I've heard things like that as well. I don't know.
The second brain.
Yeah, but I know there's definitely a lot going on there. There was a relative of mine, my niece, actually, well, she's a niece-in-law. She's about almost as old as I am, and she was a doctor who discovered this connection between the gut and the brain that is responsible, well, not completely responsible, but is one of the major factors in the development of autism, which has to do with the way in which we use serotonin versus was it? I think it was serotonin and dopamine. Wait, no, it was just serotonin. Okay, I forgot for a moment there. It's just basically the way that we use serotonin in the gut versus in the brain gets flipped, because it's the same molecule ends up being I'm not going to try to get into it much because I don't actually understand it that well. I haven't spent enough time. But basically there's a way that serotonin is used in the gut, and it's different than in the brain, and then those get flipped. And so it was a fairly major discovery into, I guess the etiology of autism. And so she's actually a fairly famous doctor, and it's just neat to see these connections starting to come out, where there's these complexities that we just did not, I guess we kind of had no hint that was going on, that there was so much. Apparently there's more bacterial DNA on and in our bodies than human DNA. That's another thing people like to bring up now. So yeah, we destroyed with all of our different chemicals and factory farming and things like that. That's such a huge impact that we didn't really realize all the stuff we're pouring on soils, not just the disruption of the soil, but the chemicals we're using on the soils, and and things like that, altering the microbiomes all over the planet, kind of at a large scale. So there's so many different effects like that are complex, contributing. I remember myself, I when I was younger, I kind of had this idea that there was a cause for something, a cause. It wasn't, this caused that. I was just, it's like, that's not how anything works. Everything is like, a zillion causes. And then you might pick one of the ones that's like, oh, that's up there in that one's a good bit higher than the next one down, and I'll just pick that one. You know, and there's just like there's this huge like bunch of causes that are that with like 0.5%. There's like 300 of those, and then you know, it's just funny.
The last 30 seconds, or you've been stopping and starting and stopping and starting and breaking.
Oh no. Okay, well, hopefully the connection will level out. I'll just cut it out in the in post processing anyway. So let me look at what I had here on the.
Anyway,
okay,
I'm a big fan of strong emergence, right? Strong emergence is where a highly complex, strongly coupled system can exhibit properties that you would never be able to recognize in the components.
Yes. Now you have a on your site. We'll have to make sure to link that. A little. You've got a lot of great stuff on your site. I hope people will go and check out his site. And he's got some various writings, some various little tidbits of wisdom that you really should check out. And I'll put those in the low bar. And one of them happens to be about emergence. And so, because that's something that I know for, just 10 years ago, people kind of thought emergence was a woo-ish, nonsense buzzword that people threw around and, to sound smart, and nobody really knew what it meant. I think that's starting to change now. People are starting to understand what it actually does mean. So people aren't using it as a buzzword as much. And instead it really does have a valuable meaning. And if you want to learn a little bit more about it, explained by a physicist, you can check out his site. And like I said, that'll be in the low bar below. So moving along to, some of the other things that we talked about, and hopefully I'll start to, slowly steer us towards the steampunk stuff here. That's what the eventual goal here is. I asked you about this emerging new field called quantum steampunk that merges information theory with thermodynamics, and you didn't seem particularly thrilled. You said, I hated thermodynamics, which elevates the mathematics of partial derivatives to the status of an explanation at the cost of inventing dozens of mystical state functions. I never understood any of it until I saw Boltzmann's simple intuitive explanation in the form of statistical mechanics, which I've cribbed on my website. That'll also be linked below. So I have to say I loved that answer. It was short, sweet, and to the point. I knew to try. I knew that trying to get into entropy at all would be a nightmare for any interview. We don't even want to start down the road of entropy. But I did ask for a quick note from you on what pitfalls to avoid in trying to understand the concept of entropy. And you said, don't use thermodynamics to explain entropy. That was the pitfall. And you gave another link to your explanation, and that'll be in the low bar as well. So is there anything you'd like to add at all, or should we let your written work speak for itself and move on to a little more? Say again?
I can give you a 30-second explanation of what entropy is.
Excellent. I love it. Please do.
Okay, suppose you have a conserved quantity like energy or money, right?
Right.
And you have a system, a very complicated system that has many different pieces, atomic level components, or people, in the case of money. Mm-hmm. And they can exchange bits of energy or money, so that there's a given microstate of the system is one in which you specify exactly how much energy every atom has, or every degree of freedom of the system has. Or exactly who has how much money, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the entropy of that system is the logarithm of the number of different ways you can divvy up the conserved quantity. It's simple as that. Okay, so it's the logarithm of the way you could divvy up ways of the conserved quantity being the money. So the logarithm of the ways. So can you elaborate on that a little bit? So what do you mean by the ways that you can divvy it up? Okay, so if we do the money part, right? Suppose you have 10 people and $10, mm-hmm. right? And the money is quantized, makes it simpler. You just have dollar bills. Yeah. One person can have all $10 bills, or mm-hmm. another person can have all $10 bills. And you can go switch that over. Or one person can. So that's 10 possibilities for one person at a time having all $10 bills, or you can have one person have $9 and one of the other people have $1.
And then you can switch all those around all over the place, and that's a bunch of ways that you can divvy it up.
Right. And then all the other possible combinations, you could eventually, you could calculate pretty easily.
Mm-hmm.
Take some time, but you could calculate pretty easily exactly how many different ways there are to divvy up $10 bills between 10 people.
Right. And so
take the logarithm of that number. That's the entropy.
That's the entropy. Interesting.
It's simple. Now you multiply.
That's a great explanation. That's really neat. I've never heard anything like that before. I appreciate that little explanation.
Instead, you multiply it by a constant so that you can measure energy in temperature units, which is silly. There's no reason to do that, but it's too late. We already do.
So it's the available microstates.
Number of possible microstates.
Right. That's kind of what I meant. It's the number of possible microstates. So why is it the logarithm of that?
Because the numbers get too big otherwise. It also makes it really very useful.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and that would take a little longer to explain.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can see how that might go a little bit down the bunny trail there, and it'd be difficult. But yeah, that's a really neat a way of putting it. But so how is that? How would I apply that? In other words, I'm hopefully there's people who are listening who want to kind of know. It's like, well, what I've always heard entropy is the chaos in the universe, and how's that entropy? What's the value of it? And one of the things that that I understood entropy to be like is that it's kind of like if there's water up high and there is area for it to go down, if it's being shaken around a lot, eventually the water is going to end up down. And so it's kind of this idea that there is a space for something to travel into, and it can eventually reach this sort of place where it no longer is very different. In other words, it's the reduction of difference in energy states. It is eventually, that's when it's kind of reached the max entropy. And that's kind of the way in which I've understood things. So perhaps you could correct me.
Well, I mean, it does. You do get the same kind of an effect. If you have usually in order for this to get interesting, you need two systems that are in thermal contact, right, or tangential contact, or whatever. Let's do it with energy and so we can do temperature and stuff. So if you have two systems that are in thermal contact, the energy can flow out of one system into the other system and vice versa. Mm-hmm. And if you take as your assumption, your fundamental assumption, which sounds actually completely unreasonable, but it is the fundamental assumption of statistical mechanics, that every possible microstate, every accessible microstate is a priori equally likely.
Yep, that's ergodicity. The ergodic, what's it called? The ergodic hypothesis? Is it? Yeah. So that means that you can never guess which microstate it's going to be in because they're all equally likely. But if there's some qualitative difference that like say, if you have system A and system B, and system A, the likelihood of having all the energy in system A and none of it in system B is kind of lower because there's lots of ways. If you have both systems engaged, you can get you get a lot larger number of different ways of divvying it up, right? So what happens is that energy will flow into the system which has low entropy, like the system B has no energy, therefore it has no entropy yet, and you'll find that there'll just be a tendency for things to flow to a state of higher entropy because there are more possibilities in that region. Okay? It won't tell you which microstate it's in, but it'll tell you which region of microstates is more likely. Yep, and so that's how the statistical mechanics, view of entropy ends up sort of giving us a type of reasoning. It's not really a physical reasoning necessarily. It's sort of a based upon availability. It doesn't feel particularly intuitive. Which is why I kind of think of it in that more physical, like you shake shit around and it'll end up at the average. I have this.
Actually, your example about the water is backwards, if you don't mind my saying.
Okay.
You have water in the ground and a tree, okay, whose roots are in contact with that water and can absorb it. And then whatever you call the stuff in the tree that allows the water to go up in it, the capillaries.
Right.
And then you have leaves up above, okay, in dry air. There's a whole lot more different ways for those water molecules to be if they go up to the top of the tree and go and evaporate out into the air. And that's how trees suck so much water out of the ground every day.
Yeah, I can see how. Yeah, I guess it's a interesting. I mean, I saw it kind of as like when it comes to just like the distribution of energy, and I tend to see energy in terms of motion, and so so I could see the problem with seeing it just as water flowing downhill, because of course you have to have gravity, and there's but there is still so it's basically filling the you see it more as filling the available space, which of course is that's kind of the whole idea there in the available microstates. There's the different ways that it can be divvied up, and when there's more ways, then it flows into that area of more ways to be, and eventually reaches kind of an equilibrium. But then if there is another place where there's more ways to be, then it goes and flows over there too. And yeah, I see how there's a problem with the analogy I was using, and I do like that. That's very interesting. Thank you very much for that. Hopefully that people will enjoy that as much as I did. Okay, great, cool. Let's see. Then what was the next thing that I wanted to move on to? Okay, so. Given that you're an experimentalist, you've been more focused on particular outcomes and hard facts of the real world more than the theoretical considerations, and those have kind of been a little bit more outside your wheelhouse because, well, when you're working with things that do things, all the the more outlandish ideas and theoretical sort of things that tends to be something that isn't as important, So hopefully. What I'm hoping to do here in this discussion is try to bring in some of the theoretical stuff, and maybe I can, wow you with something that you never, really cared that much about as something that may be valuable. I'm hoping I can bring something up that you'll be like, hey, okay, maybe that is a little bit valuable in some of those various theoretical considerations and stuff like that. So as I try to draw you into a little more of the less hard science, a little more softer science. My point here will be to try to communicate how there's a certain point in history where there was no experiment to differentiate what path to take in developing physics, yet we still chose a path anyway. And I want to highlight exactly how and why that point exists and what difference it makes in a measurable real world. I want to show how a metaphysical decision from over a century ago that is without empirical basis guided our development of the modern mathematics and assumptions of physics today. So I'm going to go back to some of the things that we had talked about. We've thrown around things in little conversations about light speed and isotropy. You know what? I planned on looking this up so I wouldn't mispronounce this over and over in this video. And so I'm probably is anisotropy and isotropy. I don't know. I'm going to mispronounce it. It's going to be fun. And so we talked a little bit about that, and then I as we were talking about that, a video came out from a YouTube channel that I enjoy called Veritasium on why the speed of light is unmeasurable, and I linked that to you, and of course I'm going to also link that below. But the idea here is so the thing I've been that is basically my whole spiel, my whole thing that I've been wanting to get across to people for, actually it's been about 15 years, is this change in science where there was what was, I'm going to give a little history of it real quickly here to the audience so they know what we're talking about. And that is there was a point at which relativity was called, sometimes called Lorentz-Einstein relativity, because Hendrik Lorentz is who initially developed the kinematical part. And Einstein, in his paper on the electrodynamics of moving bodies, which is the 1905 paper that you know of as special relativity, he actually separated into the kinematical part and the electrodynamical part, because the part that he was really advancing was the electrodynamics. He was simply taking Lorentz's prior art and saying, this is good prior art, I'm going to advance it. And so a lot of people don't understand that the Lorentz transform. Why do we talk about the Lorentz transform? Why do we talk about the Lorentz factor? Why is it all this Lorentz in special relativity? And there's even been confusion where it's like, oh, he was plagiarizing. No, he gave plenty of credit to Lorentz. So the thing is, Lorentz, there's also Lorentz Poincare Aether. So what this means is that someone else also developed the electrodynamical part to Lorentz's kinematical part, and both of them, however, one needs to understand, are entirely based upon the way that ether affects light. So Lorentz was developing a theory based around the Michelson Morley experiment, to say, why is it that the Michelson Morley experiment is null? What is going on? And he had entirely the belief that the ether was definitely, absolutely there. And then he developed a mathematical model to describe what was occurring and how you could get a null on an interferometer if there really, really is an actual ether there. And then from there, Poincare developed his electrodynamics, and Einstein developed his. And the thing about it is that Einstein said, we don't need to think about the ether. Poincare, on the other hand, basically it was a relativistic ether that was Lorentz, Poincare, relativistic ether. And then these two basic ideas were kind of in competition around that era. And one won out over the other rather quickly. Well, not quickly. I wouldn't say that, actually. Strongly. There was one won out over the other, but they were well known to be what was called mathematically equivalent. In other words, many times people would say, oh, well, this is the same as that. It comes out exactly the same in every way. So the main argument that has always been used is one that's come up earlier in this discussion, is Occam's razor. If you have one theory that's simpler than the other, then shouldn't you just pick the simpler theory? And because that tends to be the one that we've always, whenever you have to make a choice, that tends to be the one that best matches nature. Nature tends to like to take shortcuts and do things the simplest possible way. And so that's generally a good way to select a better theory. And so I'll be getting into some arguments about how that selection where we decided, oh, well, if you don't need the ether, then get rid of the ether. That's not really a simplification as per Occam's razor in the way that anybody thinks. Even though that is when if you look it up, you go talk to people, try to figure out why we picked one or the other. That is going to be the argument that you will hear. And I'll tell you why it's a very, very, very bad argument, because it's exactly the opposite. Where if you were going to choose one over the other for Occam's razor, it would be special relativity and Minkowski spacetime that would fall to Occam's razor versus the relativistic ether. So all that aside, what you'll probably want to do if you're watching this is go watch that Veritasium, pause here, open another tab, and go check out that Veritasium video, because we're going to be talking about light speed anisotropy, which is basically the idea that light speed, if it's different in one direction than from the other, and that sounds like, oh, isn't that a violation of constancy? there is this issue, and that's what I've been promising that me and Jess would talk about, that we could try to figure out this idea. I wanted to explain to him how it is that what was Lorentz's idea of how to make this work, and then how did that differ from what we have today, which is based upon Minkowski's spacetime. And I wanted to talk about how that differs and what it might mean for us that we don't have empirical evidence between the two. So that video by Veritasium, Why is the Speed of Light Unmeasurable, is going to talk to you about the idea of constancy, the constancy of light being something that if you can only measure it in two different directions, you don't know for sure if the speed of light in one direction is exactly the same as it is in the other direction. That's called the isotropic speed of light, but it can appear to be precisely the same in all directions, and that's the trick. That's the trick actually that Lorentz used, and we're going to get into that. So you might want to watch that video real quick and then come back, because now we're going to start talking about that. So hopefully, Jess, you're going to indulge me a little bit here, and maybe I'm going to tell you something that you'll enjoy, that you'll like, you'll find useful. Who knows? But stop me if I start to get far afield, if I stop making sense, or if I say something you're like, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't match the experiment, that doesn't work with this. Please do stop me immediately, and we'll talk it out, because that's what I was hoping we could do.
Okay, well, I can say right off the top that I provisionally what's the word I'm looking for? I stipulate provisionally that the argument about not being able to measure the speed of light in one direction is probably, I can't see a problem with that.
Yeah,
might be so. Right?
Yes, I agree. And here's the thing. Okay, so let's start down that a little bit. So now, if you go to Wikipedia, and there's a nice big long list of all these experiments that attempted to test the one-way speed of light. And what ends up happening repeatedly is that in all of those cases, there are arguments that say that test of the one-way speed of light actually is testing the two-way speed of light. I do not necessarily agree with that argument, but that is the consensus idea. In other words, consensus generally feels that we have never successfully tested the one-way speed of light. And there are some of it's good reasoning, some of it is circular reasoning. And by this, what I mean is before we get there, I'm trying to figure out which, what order of events here, because there's two things that might be better for starting with. But I think maybe we should start with, exactly how is it that Lorentz came up with the Lorentz factor? What is it that he was thinking? How did he get there? Because it's really, really simple. And a lot of times nobody's taught this, and nobody really talks about it because it's old history, it's old news. But I think it's really important, to understand that he was developing a mechanical wave theory. And that does not make sense in the context of constancy. So the constancy of light and a mechanical wave propagation are incompatible. First off, does that make sense to you? Because that's not something that people really talk about much. The idea of the constancy of light and there is completely eliminates the possibility of light being a mechanical wave.
Well, I've heard that Maxwell was all believed in the ether for many years, but in order to get it to behave, in order to be able, the problem is Maxwell's equations, taken at face value, predict exactly the same thing as Einstein. It says that electromagnetic waves propagated at a speed that you can actually determine by making measurements in a laboratory with magnetic fields and electric fields that have nothing to do with light.
Yes, but that is measuring the speed of electric fields and magnetic fields, but that does not.
He didn't measure. There's the two constants that go into the equations. Okay, the permeability and the permittivity of free space. Put those together, take square root flip it over, that's the speed of light, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what
Right.
his equation says. Now, he said, okay, I must have missed something because you can't have a wave without something to wiggle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he believed that. I don't know whether he believed it to his death, but I mean,
I'm pretty sure that there was, he did believe it to his death. He said that the electromagnetic medium behaves as wheels, pulleys, and gears. So it's so he definitely did believe that. And from when you read through his papers, he's constantly talking about this model that he was using to determine, it was an inviscid fluid model of how that these things occurred. So the idea, so I guess what I want to talk about is the idea of what constancy is, and we'll go back to the old school explanation of constancy and what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the incompatibility of a mechanical wave medium and the idea of constancy, and how constancy, there's a difference between isotropic constancy and anisotropic constancy. How there's when you can create something that is like constancy, and that is basically an illusion. And I talk about this regularly. And then so you can take the illusion as reality, or you can see some sort of special mechanics to the illusion. So getting into that. So the idea of constancy is best explained, and I like to use the trains and things like that. This is a steampunk thing here, so I'm going to go back to some of the terminology of the era. And that is, so if you're on a train traveling nearly the speed of a bullet, and you pass someone on the ground who fires a bullet in the same direction that you are moving, what you'll see when you look out the window, if they fire it right as you pass, is a bullet slowly passing you. It'll actually be falling to the ground, but it's basically just kind of slowly passing you, right? Then if you are in a train traveling nearly the speed of light, pass someone on the ground who has a laser beam, who fires a laser in the same direction that you're traveling, when you look out the window, you will not see the laser beam, the first wavefront of the laser slowly passing you. Instead, it will be passing you at the speed of light. So that says to common sense that, well, then that's two different speeds. The guy on the ground is going to see light going like double the speed of light. How can that? That doesn't make any sense. So that's where people first run into the first problems with the idea of constancy. So here's the way that Lorentz solved it. And so Lorentz, and we're going to talk about the geometry of it, because he was, like I said, he was explaining what was going on in the Michelson Morley experiment. That was his goal. It actually came from, there's like a lot of times people talk about Fitzgerald and Lorentz contraction, that was a suggestion of Fitzgerald, and that Lorentz, actually fairly recently I found that Fitzgerald was the first to publish the Lorentz factor, and a lot of people don't that has very recently come out, as as we get more and more history on digitized online, and something people kind of only recently found, this little tiny blurb that he published. I've got an alarm trying to go off over here.
That was mine.
So there's this. So there was a publication by Fitzgerald. He was the first one, and this, it actually goes back further than that, but that was probably the first enunciation of the change factor. And so, what is the change factor? What was going on there? What is this idea of constancy? And that's kind of really important to this whole discussion. So the best way to kind of describe it in steampunk terms is, let's imagine I have a gun, a ray gun that can slow somebody's time. And so their perception of time, so I close all the windows on the train, and their perception of time is slowed enormously. And so now inside, if I've slowed everything, so their perception, everything has changed, that means they'll drop a ball and everything will look normal to them, because the ball is moving slowly, their mind is moving slowly, everything will be slow inside the train. Now I open up the windows and they look outside, and what's happening? Everybody's running around really fast, because their perception is slowed. More events occur during the period of time that they're perceiving things. So they look around, see things moving around really fast. So here's a neat trick. What if you are traveling nearly the speed of a bullet, and it's slowly passing you? What if I decide to try to trick you into thinking that your time has not been altered? I could adjust your time so slowly that when you looked out the window to see that bullet past you, and when you're traveling nearly the speed of a bullet, that as it's passed you, instead of it passing you very slowly, it passed by faster because of your slow time. And I could adjust it just right so that it passed you at the speed of a bullet. So I can alter your time such that your perception of events has been changed. However, now here's the trick, and here's the problem, and here's why an isotropic, light speed, constancy, all of that is important. So now I've just described something that happens with relativities. You've got, the shortening and all of those things, the length contraction, time dilation, all these things are part of relativity, and they come from Lorentz and Fitzgerald. At this point, however, though I can slow your time for a bullet traveling in the same direction as you, what about bullets traveling in the opposite direction? Their speed will be doubled when you test it outside the window. So what if, instead of allowing you to test the speed of a bullet outside your window, I instead make you test the average speed of the bullets outside your window, traveling in both directions, and there's lots of them going by. Then, no matter how fast you go, so long as I adjust your time just the right way, and I only allow you to measure the average outside, you will think that the speed of a bullet is constant, and that it is isotropically constant because you don't know there is a difference in your relative speed, because I'm only allowing you to get the average of the two. I'm not allowing you to get just one way at a time. So that is the critical decision point between an ether theory and a relativistic ether theory. So in Lorentz Poincare relativistic ether, there is the belief that you really do shorten up. There is basically, the initial idea was perhaps there were a chain that as ether flowed across particles, it caused them to be drawn more towards each other. And so the shortening actually did occur, and that the other thing that occurs. So I probably should bring up. Let me share a screen real quick, because this is something that's helpful with a diagram. Yes.
I'm not sure I understood. I'm not sure I heard correctly that I thought you were attributing to the Lorentz transformation of Einstein, the one that I know. Mm-hmm. That it predicts time dilation and Lorentz contraction as two separate phenomena. No,
it's one thing.
Yes.
It is a singular thing, but it's just, you have to, if you're talking about it's all one thing. It's all one singular effect, and so it's just like and part of it is because of the fourth dimension. Like, you're used to the fourth dimension being something that is where space and time are conjoined, and the fourth dimension is something that is kind of pseudo-physically real. It is not just, you're not just keeping up with change. Like, in other words, there's the idea before Einstein, the idea of time was that it's just a measure of change, and it's not something that would be a real dimension. You could have a fourth dimension in your mathematical accounting of reality progressing over time, 3D reality, but that is not the same as space-time, where time is, you can travel, basically when you travel through space, you are traveling through time. That is completely from Minkowski. So I am talking about something that is prior to Minkowski, which was 1907. And so that is what I'm trying to first talk about, is Lorentz's ideas of it, and and trying to say this is where we started from. We eventually got to this other place, but I want to talk about the different ways you could get there.
The only reason I stopped on that is that you talked about having a ray gun that slows down time, and that is not what happens in relativity.
No, there is this idea of slowing time, though. I wanted to simply demonstrate the difference between how you could. The point here is to give people the idea that relativity is not nonsensical in other words, you can have a very intuitive, mechanical idea of how relativity occurs. In other words, this is where Lorentz came from. Now, it would not necessarily be considered correct in the view of saying special relativity, the way that we know it right now, is absolutely the way things are, period. It would not be correct necessarily in that, but I am talking about what is the history, the idea. How do we get there? What were we thinking? How does the logic work? And is it rational? And so I'm trying to point out the rationality, because a lot of times when you're introduced to the idea of relativity, you're told you can't understand it. Things get shortened. You're traveling through time at the same time you travel through space, and just accept it. You'll be fine. Shut up and calculate. And so it's there is kind of this feeling that people get when they first encounter it, because they're like, that doesn't make sense. Actually, there's a way that it does make sense, and that's what I'm trying to point out with the idea that you can shoot a I can make a bullet seem to travel at a constant speed. And that's the thing. It's like when you put thing in a ballistic fashion like that, it's very mechanical. It's very real, hard, and easy to understand how something can appear to be conflicting. Because the idea of a bullet traveling the speed of a bullet, even when you're traveling nearly the speed of a bullet, seems completely nonsensical on the face. However, once you realize that your perception of the event can be changed such that when you're measuring that same bullet, the person on the ground measured it as at the speed of a bullet, and you measure it as at the speed of a bullet. And those are not actually in conflict.
On average. Yes,
on average. But the trick is that, right, exactly. So the point is that there is a way in which that is not nonsense in any way. It is not conflicting. In other words, there are two viewpoints where both of them are saying it's traveling at the speed of a bullet compared to me, and it's not conflicting. It's not solipsism. It's not, it is not, there's not a break in reality there where two people are measuring the same thing and should be getting two different things, but instead are getting the same thing. And that's the idea of constancy, is two people, that's where people run into it. It's like they should be getting a different measurement and they're getting the same measurement. That breaks reality. And that's where people first run into it.
But only for the average. Only for the average of coming and going.
Yes. In this specific instance, it's only for the average of coming and going, and that is actually going to eventually be my point. And that's what this light speed and isotropy versus isotropic light speed is all about. So going back to what Lorentz was doing. So the Michelson Morley experiment, we know, was reported as null. That was what Lorentz was going on. Now, it wasn't actually null, and that's a whole other discussion we started on a little bit. But the idea that it was null is what kind of the basis from which Lorentz started. But actually, you find out that Fitzgerald started back further with the Fizeau experiment. There are indications of relativity in the Fizeau experiment, and that goes all the way back to Fresnel. But that aside, so there actually is a history of it didn't just come out of the blue. There are little points at which it was iteratively developed. And so the evidence didn't come from one place; it came from multiple places, and over a lot of hard science over time. And that's why a lot of times if you talk in any way negatively about relativity, they think that you're contradicting. I'm not contradicting relativity. That's not happening. Okay, so here you have Lorentz going, all right. So I've got, I believe in the ether wind. That is an absolute thing that they were. The idea that there was not an ether is completely nonsense to them, because so the basis of the idea of a wave, for instance, prior to 1905 is when we gave up the idea of mechanical waves. It was the first time light, when we say it is a constant, people kind of think of that as it just travels at a specific speed, and it's not like sound that you can vary the temperature and it'll travel different speeds. That is not what constant means in relativity. Constant means it behaves in a way that is completely different from all waves that have ever existed of any kind in the universe, period. You cannot have a sound wave behave as a constant in the way that light behaves as a constant. And so that's one of the things where there is a disconnect in the terminology, that there should have been kind of neologism developed for the idea of constancy of light, because with a constancy of light, is that neat little effect where even though you should see a difference, you do not. And that means that the universe has to be doing something different. It is a quality of when you believe light to be truly constant, you believe the universe to be different because it cannot be separated from that. And that's where the idea of space-time and all that comes in. So here we have, let's instead go back to Lorentz and what he was thinking. How did he come up with the change factor? And he came up with the change factor based upon the Michelson Morley experiment. So the Michelson Morley experiment, he knows, all right, so I believe in the ether. I believe that there's a wind going across the Michelson Morley experiment and that there is a ether wind. He believed this to be true. But how is it, according to what Fitzgerald is saying, how is it that it's hiding the effect? How's it doing that? How's it making it where even though if you send light, okay, so there's a swimmer in a river is one of the best ways to see the idea of a wave in a medium. And prior to 1905, one of the things I wanted to say is that the idea of a wave, it could not exist without a medium because it is an action, it is not a thing. It's just like you cannot believe a wave in the ocean is a thing. It is what the water is doing. It is a compression and rarefaction. It is a distribution of it is a disturbance from equilibrium is what a wave is in mechanical wave terms, and that is all it has ever been up until 1905 and special relativity. Is that there was never, you could not say that an action, you can't have a run without a runner. You can't have an action occur without something doing the action. So this idea of a wave without a medium was completely new, and specifically because of Minkowski, but we'll get into that later. So he says, all right, so I believe in this ether coming across this experiment. That means that if light travels upstream, it's like trying to catch up, and then it hits the other mirror and comes whoosh, right back, right? So it has to really make it, it's swimming upstream, and then it's pulled back. And then the light going back and forth this way, well, it's having to travel this weird angle and then come back over to it because the whole device is moving. And so the light's got to do this angle to this mirror and then come back over here and meet it. And so there's like this, and then you say, okay, well, now I gotta calculate that geometry. I gotta figure out how is it that, one meets up with the other. Well, it turns out they absolutely will not meet up with each other unless there is a very specific relationship. That's what the change factor is. So let me bring up a little diagram real quick because this is better seen with a diagram. Share the screen. Let me make sure I've got this open. Yes. All right. Chrome tab. Aha. There we go. All right. Let's see how this works. Okay. So these are some little it's a little blog I made years and years ago, and I haven't updated it very much. So the idea is that one of the things you need to consider, of course, in this first diagram, I'm not sure why I have it first, but we'll just go with it, is that the idea of a ruler, something can be shortened. And so, as you're measuring light, if your ruler is changed, you're gonna measure different speeds of light. So that's part of the consideration. And so this was kind of in this blog here, I was going over the history of how, what he was thinking, how did things, occur to get this idea that you're going to, come to this null conclusion. That's not as important. So yeah, here's an idea of a typical kind of look at an interferometer where, it's traveling across at that angle. And so you have that part, but I think what I wanted to show instead was, here we go. All right, so let's convert this instead back to that physical version. So theoretically, a wave should never, as if it's mechanical, should never behave as a constant because that would require the universe to wrap itself around that wave, and that's basically what you have with space-time. But here we're going to do it instead. I'm going to build a truck out of materials that shorten with respect to the wind. So first, not doing that, our first trick is our first trip there. We got a round trip of 20 milliseconds in either direction for two sound reflecting materials. One going across the wind and one going up and down the wind. And if you're traveling at half the speed of sound and the truck is just normal, then what you're going to end up having is that you see the little blue line I've got. It's reflecting, and then it actually reaches the origin before the red line does. So your round trip would be 23.094 at half the speed of sound, going the cross direction, and it would be 26.666 in the other direction. So the blue beam is going to arrive before the red beam does. So what Lorentz needed to do is make it not do that. Make them come back at the same time. So if I have a truck that's made out of this material that shortens in the direction whenever wind passes over it. Now the whole experiment, every bit of it, when wind travels over this special alien material, this is an alien experiment, it will actually shorten up in the direction of the air wind. And so what will happen if it shortens with respect to how fast you are going through the wind, and even if I make clocks that basically tick based upon shooting sound waves back and forth, what I can end up doing is creating the illusion of sound speed constancy, because the truck will shorten up such that it's actually 8.66 feet. Now, if I were to measure that with a ruler that's made out of the same material, I'll still measure it at 10 feet, but it'll actually be, with respect to the ground, that 8.66 feet. And so what ends up happening is that it's related to that angle that the sound has to travel. There's only one angle that will actually make it to the reflection and back to the origin, the moving origin. And this is the trick that Lorentz was attempting to create. This is what he created, is this trick that is where your devices are changed. So the only question then is, well, what about time then? Because this is only just shortening. All I've done is made sure that the sound, if it's a chirp that will reflect off of something, out to the side and reflect off of something in front of me on this truck moving through the wind, I want them to come back to the origin and meet at exactly the same moment. Well, all that has to do is just shorten up by a certain amount. But well, what about time? Well, as you can see, the time was normally a 20 millisecond round trip. Now the total time is a 23.094 millisecond round trip. So what happens that is the change factor. And as it turns out, this is just geometry. It's just, you can see my little thing off here to the on the right hand side, where you can just take it and just use sine and cosine, and you can arrive at the change factor. It's just trigonometry, Pythagorean theorem. That's all it is. So in other words, all he was really doing, it wasn't that complex. He just found that there is only one angle at which the light can reflect and come back to the origin, and that means that the origin must be shortened up by a certain amount. So in this way, now what I've created is that illusion of constancy. So this is very different than what we understand about special relativity today, right? That is this little illusion I've played where things take longer to occur. So in other words, that's one thing I didn't explain. So how did they then explain the idea of time dilation? Because I've explained length contraction here. What about time dilation? The experiment takes longer. So that means if all events are mediated by if all events are mediated by electromagnetism. So in other words, all interactions between particles, etc., then no matter what angle you might have two particles with respect to each other, they have to have this back and forth sort of communication. And if the speed of light is then altered in that way because it's having to swim upstream and back, then the total round trip between particles interacting will take longer. So therefore, everything will actually behave slower. In other words, you will actually have time dilation as well. So this is how time dilation and length contraction works in a completely physical manner in an ether theory. And that is what Lorentz intended initially. And that's what Lorentz Poincare ether, which is relativistic, as you can see, also is specifically saying that there is an ether wind that we could never detect. And that's why they're like, well, if we can never detect it, it's not experimentally sound. So therefore, falls to Occam's razor, because we don't need to why do you need to think about the ether if you can't detect it? Because no matter what you do, you end up like, not detecting this difference. Because this ends up showing that is the final point here, is that idea of light speed and isotropy. This is averaging it out. This little way that I've done, that I've shown that Lorentz was making a cute little illusion of constancy. This physical idea of constancy is radically different from Minkowski spacetime. Yet it comes to the same conclusion. And that's kind of the thing that I don't think most people are aware of. I'm not sure that would have that. Oh, hold on a second. That was not what I intended. There we go. That is something that's not frequently brought up anywhere. Actually, I've never seen it brought up anywhere. I've looked and looked and looked, and nobody other than I found that John Stuart Bell of the Bell inequalities, he actually talked about how he felt that it was important to bring people along the path of Poincare and Lorentz to understand it better, and I agree with him. And that's the only thing I've seen in 100 years, of looking at the history of people's conversations and things like that over that past century, of anyone ever talking about this, because it's reliant upon physical mechanical waves. It is and the idea that this was the impetus behind the Lorentz factor is kind of counterintuitive, because of the fact that what you understand from Minkowski spacetime is radically different. It is the same conclusion, yet radically different. It's two different versions of reality. And so that is kind of what I've been wanting to talk about, is that here you have a mathematical structure. We won't call it the same. It's not exactly the same in certain ways, but it is a mathematical structure that is sort of equivalent. And do you see how these two things are equivalent in a certain way? Because I've just been talking along, and so hopefully does this sort of make sense now?
I understand that the ether drag theory that causes things to shrink by exactly the right amount to give you the illusion of Lorentz contraction. Well,
right.
Lorentz contraction. That is what Lorentz contraction is in this model. It's caused by ether drag, right?
Well, it's caused, by the interaction of the ether. The ether, what was it called? 4 hours of sleep. Can't remember it. The idea that there was a partial ether drag proposed by Fresnel that he predicted in the Fizeau experiment, and then was verified by the Fizeau experiment, we now actually see that as the velocity addition formula. In other words, those two things are basically the same. And so it is yes, it is somewhat related. I wouldn't say it's necessarily exactly that the way that you were putting it. I don't know why I feel like it's slightly different, but that's.
Oh, I mean, you were talking about how the length of the truck has to change, right?
Yes, right. In other words, it is an impact of the ether. Right, exactly. The ether definitely is the causal, component here of why things are shortening up.
Yeah. So I mean, we can go through a list of phenomena and try to find out if they all come out the same. Mm-hmm. But the first thing I would say is that if there is an ether, and if light is a mechanical wave, and if the ether causes things to contract as they flow through it, or it flows through them, or whatever, mm-hmm. to quote from Samuel Clemens he was talking about death, but it's the same conclusion. He said, either death is like sleeping, and I like sleeping, or it's not, in which case I have some questions.
Yes.
And that's the problem with the ether, is that if there is an ether, I have a lot of questions about it, right? I want to know what it's made of. I want to know how what its properties are. I want to know whether all matter is equally contracted by its flow through the ether drag, and how we're moving with respect to it, and how come it seems to be so slow here.
Right.
And what is this? Is this really the center of the universe after all? Right?
Well, I mean, that's our first impression of the idea of when you look at the what's it called, the speed at which all things are receding from us, all the galaxies, the redshift makes it appear as though we're at the center of the universe as well, but that's an illusion, right? And so, in other words, of course, there are ideas that sometimes you can first think that you're at the center of the universe when you look at it from a certain perspective, then you realize, oh, no, that's not actually right. And so, yeah, I could see how that would seem correct. But so if you're interested in knowing some of the things, because there's a lost history of what people's ideas, like ether theory, continued to be developed all the way up until the culmination of ether theory, I would say, is the 1909 Cosserat. It's called a Cosserat continuum. We now call it micropolar elasticity. We use it in a lot of material science. That was the highest form of ether at that time. But ether theory was developed. It's what led to modern physics. In other words, there were these, the ideas of knot theory, fluid mechanics, development of elasticity. All of these things were done through ether theory, and they eventually, we now have them in, instead of you've got topology, for instance, and there was actually Einstein went on Kelvin's birthday was talking about how Kelvin had added to topology, but what he was referring to was Kelvin's work on advancing ether theory, and specifically his ring vortex atoms. So there is a lot of information, and I understand it's like, well, there's a million different things that need to be accounted for, and I've spent a lot of time working on that as well, and figuring out, what was the history, how did they perceive these things, because these were no slouches. The 19th century gave birth to 20th century physics. They weren't just coming up with nonsense magic. This was a real valuable theory that was considered of a lot of things. And some of the things that people talk about, well, what about these, stellar aberration? What about, there's a lot of things that do have to be considered. And if there's any things that specifically come out to you that you want to, stop me. But some of the first things that I think are valuable in understanding ether theory is, well, my one caveat that is specifically my own view of things, and I'll say that beforehand, is that I believe that Fresnel is who made the very first mistake that caused ether theory to look wrong. And that is, he used, you could switch density and rigidity to come out to the same number. And he decided that what was going on was density, when he should have instead used bulk modulus. And what this means is you're basically turning the universe more inside out. So the idea of ether theory is that there is no such thing as anything other than ether. In other words, all atoms are like flywheels. Okay. In other words, the energy that's stored in an atom is when the ether is flowing in a way that it is it's basically kind of like a fractal vortex. In other words, there is a way in which an inviscid fluid, a superfluid, can change the way in which the waves are basically turning around and coming back into the center of it, and so that it can be self-sustaining. So the idea, and this kind of comes from a lot of what Kelvin was initially working on. In other words, he first starts with a torus, and he got that from Helmholtz, I think, and the idea that because a torus is, of course, a type of vortex in 3 dimensions that stays together much better, right? In other words, a 2-dimensional vortex right off the bat starts, it turns into turbulence and viscosity, and it's torn apart. But a toroid, on the other hand, stays more self-contained. Well, then there may be more complex versions of that, and that's where knot theory comes from. Kelvin's vortex atoms is because he was exploring the idea of something more complex in nature than just simply a torus, and its ability to become a flywheel. And so the words, you're aware of a flywheel, conservation of angular momentum. Basically, you can store energy in a flywheel, and that's what an atom theoretically is from an ether theory perspective, is a storage of motion. In other words, a storage of energy through the rotation of the ether. And of course, that means that there are, just like when you look at a tornado, you think of, when I say tornado, you think, oh, the funnel cloud, but that's not the whole tornado. That is only the point at which it crosses what's the word I'm looking for? Not a barrier, it's a transition point. So in other words, when the relative humidity is altered by the rotation of the air to a certain point, you see droplets of water appearing, and then that gives you this borderline of where what you think of as a tornado. But the wind is moving almost exactly the same speed right next to what you think of as the border of the tornado. So the tornado is actually much bigger than that borderline you think of. And so you think of it as a unit when it's actually much more spread out than that. So that is also kind of an integral part of the ideas in an ether theory, is that we look at the idea of what free space is and what we are as radically different. Now, this is the idea of quantum spin foam and things like there are a variety of things that border on this idea and kind of come from 18th century physics. Or 19th century, sorry, that basically we're looking at the universe inside out. And so what is the more ephemeral thing is matter, and what is the more hard thing is the ether. In other words, we see things in a completely opposite fashion from what is the reality. So that by itself, why I say that Fresnel kind of caused a problem is, if you understand it as bulk modulus instead of density, then you start seeing the universe more inside out like that, instead of seeing matter as these points or these hard balls or anything like that. Instead, matter becomes more of a phenomena that is reliant upon these thresholds. That is reliant upon thresholds. And like, for instance, you're familiar with, like, if you were to take a fluid, rotate it at a given speed, there's a speed at which you could cause it to cavitate. And you can cause cavitations in a fluid where it rips itself apart because you're overcoming the elasticity of the fluid. And so there are things that can happen in a fluid that have to do with overcoming its properties of the ability to distribute energy. And so that is also relative to how atoms would then work in an ether theory, is that there is the combination of waves and vortices. When you, of course, a wave can pump a vortex, and a vortex will actually give off waves. And so there's wave vortex duality. So if you see atoms as, instead of wave particle duality, as wave vortex duality, and that is, so where's wave vortex duality? I like to kind of describe that. That is, if you have two waves go through each other, for instance, they don't just bounce off of each other, they actually go through each other. Well, what's occurring to the components of a water wave, for instance, as two waves go through each other? Well, they're experiencing a rotation. So it's these rotations that occur and the same thing is true. Like if I take a wave pool and I create standing waves in it, well, what will occur, of course, and you've got this checkerboard of standing waves. We also have a checkerboard of vortices that'll be underneath all of those little standing waves that are in a checkerboard. And so there is a kind of a well-known phenomena of wave vortex duality. So that would be part of the way in which the atom is self-interacting, and basically the only perpetual motion machine that exists is these flywheels, because they're basically, it's just like rotation. You set something in motion in space, continues rotating indefinitely because of a lack of friction. Well, the ether, seen as a superfluid, also has those same sorts of properties. And so there is this development right from Maxwell treating the ether as a superfluid all the way to the Cosserats, and then there was probably one of the biggest problems that they had in the 19th century was elasticity. So how could you have an elastic medium working for this? Because it was a big problem. That actually Kelvin solved in 1889, just 2 years after the Michelson Morley experiment, in what he called the an adynamic. The hydrostatic adynamic constitution of ether, and that's where he finalized his idea of a rotational elasticity that comes from McCulloch. So there were, and why that was important is because at the time people were saying, well, Maxwell's theory, it's just these fields, and that's not physical, and that doesn't make sense. And so it was the first indication that, of the idea of a field that doesn't have to make sense, doesn't have to have any physical mechanics. It's just a field, and that's where that first started developing. But there was this anxiety at the time, and that is how Kelvin actually sort of solved that anxiety of this sort of non-physical elasticity that didn't, the elasticity wasn't working out until he got to that point. So having this basis for an idea of that there are in a given atom, there you have these you have waves that are going in and out. There's actually a video that I use frequently where it's called cymatics, where they'll vibrate water at a given speed, and you can actually see a torus will first be the first formation, but then inside the torus, to allow the waves to move, it creates vortices, and those vortices will, in the most simple version of the torus that only has two waves going back and forth, it'll actually create two internal vortices that look very much like the d orbital of the Schrodinger equation. And so there are these ways in which you could see that basically complex rotations of an inviscid fluid come out to plus instead of seeing the ether as a grid, instead of seeing it as like there's this grid that we're on, instead you see it as an actual fluid, which means there's going to be local eddies, local currents, there's going to be a tremendous amount of local effects and changes to that substance. Then you end up seeing that the ideas of the premise behind the Michelson Morley experiment was what had a flaw in its initial expectations. But then when you go and you look at the historical record, you find that there was an effect that we found, like I was talking to you earlier about Dayton Miller, where he found the 8 to 10 kilometers per second wind that he won a prize from the AAAS, and for detecting the ether, because he found effects that varied with the sidereal day. They varied with the Earth's relationship to the sun, and in a systematic effect. So not just systematic effects in the readings of the interferometer, but systematic effects that were related to the sidereal day and the Earth's relationship to the sun. So I mean, there was really interesting things there.
The stuff that Michelson and Morley were looking for originally.
Yes, and they actually did detect. So when you look at the original Michelson Morley experiment, what you understand that they should be looking for is, well, they first expected the ether to be a grid. That's a problem, and then they also expected the wind to be east-west specifically, instead of simply looking for where the highest reading was. But the one thing that you have to know about the Michelson Morley is that if it was random, that's one thing. However, what you would expect of a wind, of an interferometer that moves like in a complete circle, is that there would be 2 sine waves of readings. In other words, 2 waves per 360 degrees. That is exactly what they did receive in that first in the original 1887 paper, and you can look it up anytime, and it's right there. There are 2 sine waves of readings, and that's also what Dayton Miller found repeatedly in all of his work. That, like I said, he did experiments in with different materials. He made sure, like for instance, I think he switched to brass, and he tried a wood interferometer, a brass interferometer, to various types of interferometers, so to make sure that there wasn't the magnetic field, because it seems as though the wind he was detecting was along a northwesterly direction, kind of towards the Earth's magnetic pole. So that would indicate that there is the wind coming from a specific direction. The only problem I have with Miller is that he did not accept Lorentz shortening. And it's because he did not accept Lorentz shortening, he was not aware of how the one thing that, by the way, that's different between the Michelson Morley and Dayton Miller's experiments and all other experiments is they use white light. And so why is that important? Why is white light an important part of the interferometer experiment as opposed to monochromatic light? Because they actually went through the difficulty of setting up their interferometers with sodium light, so that they could actually get the double fringe to find out where the exact middle, so that they really did within, adjust their mirrors within just tiny differences, the actual distance that light traveled. They were matching up the single wavelengths with the other wavelengths. In other words, there was not that in monochromatic light. You can just take it and shift the phase a mile if you like. It doesn't matter, or many miles in certain instances, and you can just match up these 2 waves that are similar, but they're not really the same light, are they? And so they made sure that even though they were going to use white light, and which white light, of course, they why not just use the sodium light that they set it up with, right? If you've already got a fringe there, why not use that? Well, because there's questions of what would happen when if there is a difference between the phase. In other words, if you have a significantly different phase, if there is variations in the frequency that are occurring that you're not aware of, because all you're seeing is averages of billions of individual waves. What if there's like it's changing and all you're seeing is an average and you're not seeing the actual thing? So there's a lot of different considerations that Michelson and Miller were taking in mind that nobody else did. And then in addition to that, you end up finding out that monochromatic light causes something called lock-in, and that is it's in all the ring laser gyroscopes and all the technology we use for guidance today. You have to add dithering or multiple frequencies. If you use just one frequency, slight differences in phase will be instantly eliminated because of lock-in. And it's kind of related to the Huygens, what's it called? Strange sympathy or odd sympathy. Huygens odd sympathy, where oscillators will, or you probably know it as like we do with phase locked loops and technologies like that, where the idea is you can reduce phase variance because there is a resonance effect that causes light to start to eliminate any kind of phase difference that's there. Well, so that's one of the problems is when in using especially lasers are particularly susceptible to lock-in, and so and the monochromatic light as well. So there are these various things that are part of why I think it's very important that Miller's work and Michelson's work was never actually replicated. And then there's the other important part that neither of them knew that Lorentz was correct. And so how do you get, because right now what I'm saying is Lorentz is correct, which means there should be an absolute null. And I'm also saying the experiments weren't null. So I seem to be contradicting myself, right? Well, the thing is, if Fresnel was right and there is a partial ether drag, then that means the index of refraction of air will be what will allow you to have a one-way speed of light difference, allow you to detect an ether wind. And it was because Michelson and Miller always did their experiments in open air, that the partial ether drag was responsible for a non-null. But every single experiment that you do in a vacuum should be perfectly null. In other words, that this is the appropriate relativistic ether expectation, that all experiments done in a vacuum should be perfectly null because of the shortening. However, if they're done with something that has an index of refraction, and of course there will be the index of refraction as it linearly goes up, the effect will have a curve that goes up and down, because you'll start to, if you understand the way in which this kind of entrainment sort of effect is happening as described by Fresnel. Now, some people don't know that Fresnel predicted the Fizeau experiment, and it came out exactly as he predicted, that there would be a partial ether drag of a specific amount, and that was because he was relating it to index of refraction. That's how he came up with it. So all of these various things lead to an idea of the ether that you could start to hook on to everything that we know today in a variety of ways. So because this is a lost history, nobody knows this history, nobody studies this history. It's gone. Nobody cares because they think it's not relevant. But the thing is, the difference between Lorentz, Poincare, I always mispronounce his name, and Einstein, Minkowski, is not based upon empirical evidence. We did not decide to choose one over the other because of empiricism. We chose one or the other because of a metaphysical preference. And the justification for that preference, I think, is extremely shoddy. So how am I doing so far?
Well, in my opinion,
story at least,
the choice was just due to laziness, basically, which is one of the most profoundly creative instincts of human beings. Most of the things that we've done that are interesting were done to try to avoid work.
Yes.
And the problem, I mean, I will stipulate. I don't know. I don't know this history, and I certainly don't know about all these guys' tests and theories about vortices and stuff. But
I guess the only thing I'm hoping for is that you could say that this is sort of rational, and that, like, if you can,
sure.
I mean, go with me on, like, suspend disbelief for a moment and say for instance, all the things I've said are true. Is there the possibility that this might fit with the one stipulation? I'll give a stipulation. So our ideas of particles, I would say the energetic particles, things like electrons, and those might be more like virtual particles instead of, because there would be a confusion there between particles that are massive versus non-massive particles. And so in other words, we'd have to see photons as a type of virtual particle instead of as a, physical traveling entity. That would be the one stipulation that's important.
All photons are virtual.
Yeah.
They have no interactions other than to be created or destroyed.
Right. And so, well, I mean, a lot of people think of, whenever we say particles, they think of that as an extant, in other words, it exists in reality instead of it being a quantity that does something. And like, I try to explain this to laymen as I could come up with the total amount of energy for a mole. In other words, the total amount of energy for a mole to go from frozen to boiling, I could call, something. And that is, so in other words, I'm relating real effects in reality to a unit. But that unit doesn't exist. It's a representation of these effects that we see in reality as things go across these borderlines. And so, it has, in all ways, it's related to aspects of reality, but it's not a real thing that exists any more than gallons exist. There's 30,000 gallons in my pool. Does that mean there's 30,000 individual jugs sitting in your pool? No. They're just an abstraction. And so understanding where this line is between abstraction units and really physically extant units is something that I think is that might change just slightly under this interpretation.
Well, the idea that some things really exist and other things are just abstractions. I think it's a bit of a religious position. That is, maybe I should stop for a second and go shut up the dogs.
All right. Yeah, we'll take a moment's break. The puppers needed attention.
The idea that some things are real and other things are just made up, right? Mm-hmm. That's kind of a metaphysical, religious issue. I think everything's made up. I mean, look, how do we have an idea of anything? We got a bunch of neurons firing in our brain, and
right.
we have models of what that means, right? Mm-hmm. If you think about what is involved in human vision, for instance, which we all like to say, seeing is believing. Well, if you believe what you see, you're a fool, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so this whole issue of whether something is real or not doesn't really. It comes down to a question of, do you know what its properties are? That there's this thing. There's things we call atoms, right? There's things we call electrons, right? Well, are electrons real things, or are they just made up? Well, they're just made up, right? Obviously. Right. But they have an enormous number of properties that we have measured very, very carefully. And if you like, you could say that our illusion has been fleshed out to the point where we have tested all kinds of consistencies of the way we look at things called electrons.
There was Einstein said something about if it's life is an illusion, it's a very persistent one.
Exactly.
Something like that.
And the thing is that in the end we choose our models for two reasons: for the effectiveness of the models and for the easiness of dealing with them. We have lots of models which are almost certainly nonsense in an absolute sense, but they work really well. For instance, quantum electrodynamics, the most successful theory in the history of science. You got to wonder a little bit about whether there's really a Feynman diagram where the photon is being emitted by one electron and absorbed by the other. But it works really well, right?
Yes, exactly. So there is definitely a value to it, and understanding that there are values to abstractions is something that people kind of have a hard time with automatically. I think, in other words, it's not. I don't feel like that's intuitive. That abstractions can be extremely valuable and therefore kind of have their own truth to them.
Well, this is what Feynman got the Nobel Prize for, was being able to make a cartoon of an extremely complicated contour integral.
Right.
And he found a way to make a cartoon of it, which makes perfect sense, all right, and which is completely equivalent to that huge contour integral. Mm-hmm. That's an amazing accomplishment. So anyway, the thing is, the problem with the ether for me is that, I mean, you've been describing a whole lot of speculations and theories about the properties of the ether and the way it works and what kind of things can be made of it and so on and so forth, which are natural. That's what one would do if one wanted to, see about if you were convinced there was an ether.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, exactly. Or if you were convinced there's some value to the idea of one. Yeah.
And I also have a deeper appreciation now for the appeal of the idea of the ether to steampunk. Mm-hmm. It's a classic steampunk topic, really.
Oh, yeah.
But the problem of this is, I have questions, and the questions don't have simple answers. The question is, we're moving with respect to other things in the universe at an enormous speed, right? Mm-hmm. A really enormous speed, like a substantial fraction of the speed of light, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm. According to, if we measure ourselves against various quasars, we're moving many times the speed of light.
And we run into these problems too.
Yeah.
But the question is, I mean, if that's so, then either the ether drag model is wrong, or somehow we're dragging the ether with us. That somehow that there's some interaction between between physical objects and the ether, which not only shortens the dimensions of the physical objects, but which drags the ether around so that we don't have a velocity through the ether that's enormous, right?
Yeah, and there is an answer to that if you'd like to hear it.
I'm sure there is, but I mean, you understand that the more questions you ask, the more complicated it gets.
Oh, of course, anything that's going to be, the whole idea is to be able to explain today's physics from a different perspective. In other words, surely you're not saying that today's physics is simple. It's a
lot simpler than that.
You think so? Really?
Yeah, I mean, like this whole business about, well, what is ether made of? What's it? How does it behave? What does it do? What are its properties? And how fast go through it? How does it drag? Blah 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 blah.
Yeah, they've got the virtual particles and the vacuum popping in and out of existence, and so
you can tie it to all kinds of other things that we're not so certain about, right? And claim to have a better way of figuring out what a virtual particle is. But I mean, the proof's in the pudding. In the end, you got to be able to do the detailed calculations with it.
Absolutely.
And you just described to me all the decades of time that you spent learning about the ether model, right? And I learned about Einstein's model in one class in college, right?
Right.
And after that, I said, "Oh yeah, okay, that makes perfect sense, I guess." And maybe it's wrong. I don't know, but it's simple.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, anything can be simple, depending on how much information. I mean, in other words, the one class that you could take on relativity, I could explain relativity in very, very short terms, or I could explain it in very, very long terms, and all the various things like how relative simultaneity works. Matter of fact, that's actually part of my blog is going into how Minkowski spacetime. Why did we come to the conclusion of conjoining space with time, and this idea of how the fourth dimension works? All of that, I mean, is extremely complex, and take it's. The relativity of simultaneity and how that works. I mean, yeah, you can reduce things down to a diagram that leaves out a tremendous amount of information, or you can go into the details of how it works. And I guess I feel like the level of complexity is I think is more of a familiarity and how much you rely upon it being true. In other words, how much you do not question it. In other words, anything that you do not question very much, you can take a very short explanation of, and therefore it is simple. However, if you question it a whole lot, it becomes more and more complicated as you try to suss out very, very tiny details. I mean, all the science a lot of the science that I'm talking about is the science that is used to uphold why it is that we believe the theory of relativity is correct. And so, most of the things that I'm talking about are actually the genesis of relativity. And so saying that it is simple is kind of, I don't know, I feel like it's not doing what?
It's simple now. Just like, have you ever read the Principia?
Oh, no, I have not. That is, I've read about the Principia.
Newtonian mechanics in the original version was not simple, right? It was incomprehensible almost. And we found ways of making it much more palatable and simple.
Well, I mean, that's like high-level languages in programming. In other words, in high-level languages in programming, you just use abstractions to other people's tremendously complicated, long-developed code, and you make a function call. That's all you do. Just make a function call, and it goes deep into this just huge, amount of things that took a very long time to do, but now you use it like it's just a button. And so it's very simple to you when you didn't have to develop it, but when you have to develop it yourself, then it is far more complicated. In the abstraction layer, in other words, you have layers of abstraction on any kind of system like that makes it, you can either see it as simple, or as the developer, you can see it as complex. But I kind of feel like that you're saying that because we've now simplified things to where you can use it more easily, because we have various ways in which we use formulas, that we have a very specific way. You use it this way. You don't have to think it out very much. You just use this formula. You get the right answer, period. You don't have to go and, it's like the issue of if you had to build a microwave every time you wanted to microwave your a slice of pizza, that'd be ridiculous. But you could just microwave a slice of pizza and continue on with what you're doing. And I think that's
not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the introductory level explanation to get people to understand how it works and be able to use it. Right.
Okay.
Be able to use it to do, experiments, complicated experiments.
Well,
never done.
I wouldn't explain it to that level. In other words, there's a level of detail that you would leave out if you wanted to explain things very simply to people. In other words, the level of detail that I would go into to justify something versus explain it to a person who is new to it, that I simply want to be able to use it. There's a huge amount of information I'd leave out about the history, in other words, and that is important. Like this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that there is too much science. You just cannot find all of it. You can't learn all of it. You can't know all of it. There's too much information there. And so information overload is counterproductive. And so I absolutely agree with you that there is a level at which you have to be able to convey things in a concise manner to be able to make them effective for a purpose. And so that is a very strong, and that's actually very much something that I've talked about with a variety of friends who are also interested in this idea of, the process of science, the theory of science. And that is, when you say, well, what if this is more correct? What if it is more correct? Will we get as much value out of that other idea as we would out of staying the course in our current ideas that we've got so many people already working with? And this is very, very closely related to the idea of using Windows, the Windows operating system. Everybody's using the Windows operating system. There's a huge number of people. Let's say Mac didn't exist. And there's a huge number of people who are using the Windows operating system, developing programs for the Windows operating system. And there's these smart guys that say, well, that's a big bloated sack of crap. And it's falling apart. It's getting worse and worse every version. But the amount of effort and money and time required to completely redevelop all of what Windows does it's huge. So there's always a point at which it's continuing to grow and more as we extend it further and further as an operating system. They're having to keep old code, really old code that's no longer really it's kludged together to fit today's purposes. And so it becomes more and more unstable as they grow it and grow it and grow it, but it's also more and more ingrained. It's more and more, we're more and more dependent upon it as a whole society. So will it reach a point at which it has a critical failure because of the level of complexity and no longer? Yes, it will. And that's kind of my point. But right now, but the money.
A decade or two ago, the U.S. Navy standardized on Windows NT, I think, to run their ships. And this first maiden voyage of the first ship that had as its operating system had to be towed back to port. Okay. Ooh. Thank God for Linux. Linux is saves the world.
I know, right? But here's the thing. So even though Linux is better, why are we not switching? Because it's easier to get people there introduced to Windows. It's easier to use Windows. There's all of these reasons why we use Windows instead of Linux, even though Linux is better, period. It's better. And so
to use Windows.
Do what?
Not easier to use Windows. That's not true.
But what I mean is it's easier.
Everybody uses Windows is because for many years, the salesmen for Windows, for Microsoft, were told, you're only going to speak to CEOs. Mm-hmm. You're never going to ever talk to the CTO, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to go into the CEO's office and you're going to say, everybody uses Windows. If you don't use Windows, you won't be able to communicate with anyone.
I know.
And that's why Windows is so prevalent.
But what I'm saying is, it's a feedback loop. It's easy to use because it's prevalent. It's prevalent. It's prevalent because it's prevalent. It's an accretion engine. and so it continues to accrete. But because of that accretion, now it's so deeply ingrained in our society that it take like a Manhattan Project level, development to get everybody off of it onto something better before the thing falls apart, because it is falling apart. It is getting worse and worse. And so and that's kind of I'm trying to present this as an analogy.
I see what you're saying.
That there is a value in what we're doing, but now we have the difference between the what is predicted about the vacuum energy level and what experiments show as a vacuum energy level is much larger than the difference between one atom and all atoms in the universe. So it is there's the issue with 95% of the universe being made of undetectable stuff. There's the issues of
95. It's only 5/6.
5/6. Is that, well, no, dark energy. I'm talking about dark matter and dark energy. So we start with dark matter.
Yeah.
And so, dark matter was just basically, that is, we found that the rotation rates of galaxies didn't fit. And so there must be something there that isn't part of, baryonic matter. And then we just continue. And so there's all these kludges that we kind of, we go, we're just continuing forward with what works. Everything works. Don't screw with it. Yeah, okay, that's a problem. Yeah, okay, that's a problem.
Well, there's a bigger problem than any of those. Really, is the whole idea of inflation, right? Inflation is, like, where the hell did that come from? It violates every rule, every law, but you know what? I'm telling you right now, I guarantee that inflation would not be easier to explain with the ether theory.
The experiments that suggest, the things that suggest inflation are different than inflation, and the things that suggest, the universe's expansion are different than necessarily the universe expansion. Like, one of the things that's one of my favorite topics to bring up is, so we have just giant gluts of plasma being blasted out into space by our sun and every other sun, and we've been starting to find all of this material between the stars that is plasma especially, and so one of the things that will cause a redshift of light and across so whenever you're looking at a horizon, right, it's kind of orangish because it's not perfectly, not all the different frequencies are shifted the same amount because of the atmospheric effects and things like that. So that's one kind of red shifting that you can tell it's caused by dust, and because the spectral lines are not all shifted equally. However, Compton
shifted.
Say again?
None of the spectral lines are shifted by sunsets.
Well, okay, the change in the light that occurs.
It's the same reason the sky is blue, right?
Right.
The shorter wavelengths are scattered more by a lot. Yeah. And so it's a matter of, the only light that comes through the dust and stuff is the long wavelength light. So,
well, my point is that there are ways in which people are. This is just something that's been explained to me. It's like they said that they, when talking about the shifting of the spectral lines, specifically why they think that dust and things like that in the universe are not causing the Doppler effect. In other words, what we see is we consider it the Doppler effect, but what it is redshift, right? It is specifically redshifting. Well, the reason why we know that it is not dust-based is because of the fact that the dust would be changing certain things about the spectral lines. So, but if all of them are shifted equally, then that theoretically should be only Doppler effect that would cause that. However, there is another explanation, and there's another effect that causes all spectral lines to be shifted by a certain amount, and that is the Compton effect. So Compton scattering does directly shift light. In other words, it redshifts light in a very all of the different frequencies equally. And so Compton, say again?
It's all the lines.
I couldn't hear you.
it broadens all the lines. They don't you don't just have sharp lines that shift.
Okay, you're talking about the scattering component of it, as opposed to the shifting component of it, right? Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, but I mean, Compton scattering is it has a broad spectrum of everything. Right?
Okay, so that is when it's scattered. However, when you scatter something there's a difference between scattering at close range versus scattering at long range, right? In other words, if I were to scatter particles, so I've got at a close range, the number of angles at which you're going to have light striking the plate is going to be varied. And that's going to cause blur, for instance, in optical effects. It's going to cause these various things that have to do. That is a typical idea of scattering, is that you've got various angles all hitting the same place because they're not the angle at which the light is moving is varied. However, at a great distance from a scattering event, the only light that will arrive, or the only particles that will arrive, are the ones that are aimed in the same direction. In other words, even though it is scattered, you will then only receive the ones that were headed in the correct direction because of the distance from the scattering event. Does that make sense?
Basically, the photon loses energy in each long range, very mild Compton scattering, and actually.
And the ones that head off in the other direction reflect back to us as the CMB. And those are actually scattering. We're seeing in the CMB, we're seeing scattering events from ones that continued on elsewhere, but these are the ones that got scattered towards us. So we end up seeing this background radiation. So that is one of the ideas of, and it's just an idea. It's just an idea for how we could say that maybe the reason why it looks like we're at the center of the universe, and that no matter however far something is from us, is exactly linearly, redshifted, is not this weird thing that makes us look like we're at the center of the universe. It's just that as you go further away, you're traveling through more Compton scattering events, and so therefore you don't necessarily have to have an expanding universe if it was in fact these scattering events. And the only argument that there's ever been proposed about Compton scattering being responsible for the cosmic redshift is the idea that there's that blur. In other words, at short range, there's blur. However, at long range, from a scattering event, there is no blur. And so that's that's the one thing that people don't think of, is that, yes, there's blur at short range. In all experiments at short range will have blur. But events at long range simply will not. And so that's
a calculation I could do. So I might actually take you up on that one.
Cool. Good. Awesome. Success.
I'm pretty sure you're wrong.
Okay, good. Yeah, I would love to know if I'm wrong. That like I said, this is not something that I don't know. I mean, maybe the universe is expanding. I don't really have a problem with that. It's just there is this alternative explanation that I found to be interesting that hasn't really been properly addressed, in my opinion. In other words, it's only been topically addressed. It's not been strongly addressed, in my opinion. There's been kind of holes in it, and I really don't care one way or the other. It doesn't even have an impact on really relativity or anything, that terrifically much. It's just interesting.
Well, I don't, like cosmology is pretty woo-woo from my point of view, but you sort of have to pay attention to it these days because that's what everybody's interested in. Yeah.
Did you know they recently admitted at a cosmology conference that there is a crisis in cosmology? They actually called it a crisis because the two different ways in which they determine the age of the Big Bang are radically different. In other words, they get radically different numbers, and they've tried to resolve them, and there is no resolution. And so they've called it a crisis in cosmology. I think it was announced at a conference in 2018. I think fairly recently. So that's an interesting little thing that they've decided they're in crisis as well. And so there's a lot of issues.
All science is in crisis all the time, and if it stops being in crisis, there's a big problem.
Exactly my point. And I think that's why. So going back to all of it. So let's say, for instance, somehow all these weird things that I've brought up, I happen to be right about these various experiments. Does it seem? Can you say at least that it seems like a somewhat rational perspective that could possibly fit with today's physics if enough different goalposts were met. In other words, enough different precise calculations when we investigate it. Is it something that you think could actually be worthy of investigation? That there might actually be this, light speed may actually be going a different speed based upon direction because of things like an ether wind. And I mean, it was Einstein in 1920, this is 5 years after general and 15 years after special relativity, said space without ether is unthinkable. So it's, and what he was talking about was Mach's idea of a basic general, the average gravitational arrangement of the universe makes for a preferred frame, and so there was this idea of ether with him. So do you think that it is that perhaps there is this thing that everything the ideas I've kind of presented here that are based upon 19th century physics, do you think there may be something worthy of investigation?
Well, I mean, all things are worthy of investigation. I mean, but you have a lot of work ahead of you.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that.
The one we were going to argue about at one point was, whether time dilation is real or not. And if you get a muon stopped in the laboratory, they're very consistent. They have a mean lifetime of 2.2 microseconds.
Mm-hmm.
2.2 microseconds, even at the speed of light, is only good for a few hundred meters.
Yeah.
Or a few or a kilometer or so. And they make it all the way down to the Earth, the high energy ones. So that's not going to happen without some pretty exotic explanation.
And that's where, that's the thing, is that I think it's really hard to explain this, because this is, a lot of this is not, the only thing that I've really added that is kind of new is this idea of turning the universe inside out by taking Fresnel's, Fresnel's formula for refraction and just changing it from, density to Bolt modulus. That's the only thing that I'm really adding. The rest of it is actually, this is just aspects of ether theory and the various people who have developed it, back in the 19th century. And so there, I think there's a lot, like I said, J.J. Thomson, I mentioned that earlier. He created a mechanical, based upon loops, and, kind of basically like knot theory, a mechanical reasoning for valence to occur. And he won some prize at his university. I forget exactly what happened there, but for this mechanical explanation of valence. And right now we just accept it. We just say, we don't have a mechanical basis for it. And when you don't have a mechanical basis for something, just like, I feel like it's just like the spirit of the fishing tree. It's an abstraction that does not allow for as much extension, because you don't have as much runway. It doesn't narrow your path of investigation as well. And when you're missing some of the background, when you say, like, for instance, okay, switching to quantum mechanics, I strongly dislike the idea of randomness at the bottom level of reality, because randomness is something I believe that only exists in the human mind, and that it is not something that exists in reality, and that it is an abstraction that obliterates any kind of mechanical basis for reality. And it comes from the Copenhagen interpretation. However,
Der Alte würfelt nicht.
Well, what is that?
It's Einstein's famous statement: God does not play dice.
Ah, yes. God dices not. Is that it sounds like? Yeah, it's and I agree with Einstein on that. And I think that I've actually done like a long analysis of the showing how it is that what Bell was talking about was a theory of experiments, not a theory of reality. And that when he was, I mean, he there's a quote. Let me read you the quote real quick that I find to be really interesting. If I can find it here, it is. I think it is it's fascinating when you find out that there are these people who are attributed with certain things, who have their name on them, and then their opinions were exactly the opposite of that in the long run. Let's see. There's one of his quotes. Okay. But in 1952, I saw The Impossible Done. It was in papers by David Bohm. Bohm showed explicitly how parameters could indeed be introduced into non-relativistic wave mechanics, with the help of which the indeterministic description could be transformed into a deterministic one. More importantly, in my opinion, the subjectivity of the orthodox version, the necessary reference to the observer, could be eliminated. But why had Bohm not told me of this pilot wave? Why did von Neumann not consider it? More extraordinarily, why did people go on producing impossibility proofs after 1952 and as recently as 1978? Why is the pilot wave picture ignored in textbooks? Should not be taught as not as the only way, but as an antidote to the prevailing complacency, to show us that vagueness, subjectivity, and indeterminism are not forced on us by experimental facts, but by deliberate theoretical choice. And that's John Stuart Bell on The Impossible Pilot Wave, 1982. So there's this idea of the Bell inequalities is held up as like the primary thing that why we believe that the universe is, random soup underneath reality because of Bell inequalities. However, Bell himself didn't believe that. I've got a quote from Schrodinger where he's like, I'm sorry that I had anything to do with it.
Schrodinger, there's a lot of good quotes from Schrodinger.
Oh yeah, really, really good ones.
But so, you asked a question a while ago.
Yes.
About whether there was any. Oh, damn it! I've forgotten what the exact question was. Whether there was anything to be gained or learned from examining the history of the ether theory. Mm-hmm. There's always something to be gained from examining, history and theories. I tend to be a bit of a Philistine in the sense that, there's a lot of things that one could do, and most of them I don't want to do because they're a lot of work, and I don't see any particular, I don't see a profit in it for myself. Mm-hmm. And I don't see a profit in it for my students because, I know how to explain one thing, and I'm happy to admit to them that it's probably wrong, and I'm almost certainly telling it wrong, but that, it gets them off the ground.
What about a profit for the advancement of science itself, though? So that's kind of my point, is that if you have a theory that will allow you to go further and resolve, because I believe that all of the various, like I've brought up, like the what's it called, the vacuum energy catastrophe. I've brought up the crisis in cosmology. I've brought into all these various things that, we find all these issues with our current models where we're hitting dead ends over and over in a variety of ways. And but at the same time, we have some of these extremely successful things. And so there's this kind of dichotomy between dead ends and extreme success. And I feel like that the extreme success keeps us from overcoming the dead ends. It's just like the issue of the extreme success of Windows allows a lot of people to do a lot of very important things. It kind of, it's part of our economy. It's part of everything. But it's also going to reach a dead end. It is starting to reach dead ends, in my opinion. So that's the same kind of thing. I feel like there is a profit to science itself to eventually have revolution. And then how can we have a revolution if we don't have something that can do exactly the same thing? And there's a very narrow window for any kind of revolution.
Okay, revolutions tend to be destructive. Okay. But I mean, let's take your analogy with Windows, okay? Mm-hmm. Linux does everything that Windows does better already. Yep. So the problem is only with acceptance. Now, you have pointed out some of the more exotic dead ends that physics seems to be bumping up against, or problems that I don't understand them, and I don't know very many people who do. I know some people who claim to, and I know some people who are working on trying to resolve some of the issues that are really problematic right now. But if you want to supplant or replace, or I guess supplant's the right word. If you want to supplant Einstein's relativity with an ether theory, your goal may be to explain some of these things that Einstein's theory has been unsuccessful at explaining. But you don't get to just do that. You have to also explain all the successes.
Absolutely, and that is that's the first. That's the first thing that you have to do. You have to do that first before anything else.
That'll take you a century.
Yeah, well, that's the issue. So,
especially with a model that's more complicated.
I don't think we're going to have to agree to disagree about the idea of complication here in this. I don't think it's actually more complicated.
You might find it conceptually less complicated, but that's it. But
I think that's something that is going to be a matter of opinion, though, in other cases. And I think that people are going to take your opinion over mine. I mean, but I'm just saying what my opinion is.
No, I understand. I mean, like I can't say that yours is conceptually less satisfying than mine, because how would I know?
Yeah,
I haven't explored yours enough to see how it could work, and I don't know the history, and I'm not liable to learn it.
Yeah.
But I mean, the point is that you do have to replace all the working components as well as the ones that are broken.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's my point, is that this is just a different interpretation of relativity. In other words, my only point here is that you don't change the mathematics. It's a mathematically equivalent formula. Okay. In other words, things don't really actually change. What changes is just your interpretation of what you're seeing. In other words, there are the points at which there is difference are very small and subtle. It's just like, how do you measure the one-way speed of light is very difficult. And that's part of why I'm saying there's such a subtle difference between the two. And so what I'm trying to establish here is, yes, they're actually, if you want to replace it, well, first off, there has been a lot of work done in a fluid dynamical model. In other words, so starting with Madelung's equations, and a variety of versions of space, they use tools from fluid mechanics. And so that's actually all I'm talking about, is attempting to use hydrodynamics as an alternative pathway to explaining the exact same things that we have now. In other words, you have to come to the same answers, absolutely. And there's a lot of work that does have to be done if you want to try to convert the mathematical methodologies that you use and try to come up with anything new. You have all this work you have to redo. It's just like rewriting a software. There's all this work. If you want to replace Windows, you got to first replace Windows. You can't fix the problems until you've replaced. But and Linux has done that, right? They have replaced Windows, but they haven't overcome the other part. And what I'm talking about, it hasn't even fully replaced what's there yet. Now, the thing is, there's a lot more there than you might think, because of the fact that I'm talking more about interpretation than I am talking about a mathematical change.
Yeah,
and because it is the same mathematical things.
If you're right, that if it's true, and I don't know, right? If it's true that the mathematics comes out the same, then it's only a matter of interpretation, and interpretation is sort of like sorry, which kind of beer you like, right?
Okay, but here's and here it is. It's not all interpretation.
There's a lot of discussion about interpretations of quantum mechanics, right? And there's many worlds hypothesis, and then there's pilot waves, and I don't care.
Right, exactly. I understand that.
Interesting.
I knew I had to get to where does the rubber meet the road. So it is primarily interpretation, but then finding a way in which that interpretation, that is a very subtle change, comes out to somewhere, some way, somehow, that it's a mathematical difference of import, right? That is what we have to establish here for it to be of any value whatsoever, other than just talking. Just like you said, it's just, who cares, right?
There certainly is a steampunk spirited concept.
Yes. So there is a difference, and that was in that video that I sent you. That he briefly mentions the fact that if light speed is different in one direction than it is in the other, then our ideas of distance can be wrong. And so in
interpretation, I don't care if ideas are wrong, right?
Well, our calculation of how far something is will be wrong based on, like, for instance, our ideas in cosmology of how far things are. That will be altered. There are, and then that's one of the ways in which the rubber will meet the road in an experiment. And I do believe there is an experiment that I've got something I actually proposed to Ruyong Wang, who's he's a person who created these experiments called the fiber optic conveyor experiments, where he basically proved that a Sagnac experiment isn't related to the center of rotation. So let me explain that real briefly, because I don't know if I've talked to you about it, because it is very much relevant. We're talking about experimental differences. What will happen differently in experiment? And that is, if you the previous explanations of the Sagnac effect, where basically take light, shine it into a splitter, go two different directions around a circle, bring it back together, and interfere it. If you move it this way or move it that way, you get a phase difference between the two. You actually get a Doppler effect as well. So there is a phase and frequency difference caused by the rotation of the device. And so Sagnac originally proposed this as a way to falsify special relativity. And so then there was, in, I think it was 1921, who was it? I've forgotten his name. Far asleep. I've forgotten his name, but he came up with an explanation for why it was okay with relativity, and it kind of it relates to general relativity, and in fact it ends up selecting a preferred frame, but in a way that is kind of hidden. And so what he did with these, what Wang did with these experiments, and I think there was it in the, I think it was in the aughts that he did these experiments. And what he did is he created fiber optic conveyors. So in other words, he could take two fiber optic loops and have them go either crisscrossed or going down where there's two, where they go around the loop, but they also go along a straight path between two loops. And so he did these different types of versions of an experiment that prove out that it has to do with edge speed. It has to do with the speed in a linear direction through space. It's not related specifically to rotation. And so in a variety of ways, he proved that our explanation that it's okay with constancy is not actually correct. And most people don't really want to accept that interpretation of the experiment, but it is really the only way that you can interpret it when you understand. And I'll give this. So if the speed of light is constant, then you're not going to have a different speed of light in one direction versus the other. However, what you are measuring in an interferometer is the speed of light difference between the two, between the two paths, basically. In other words, with respect to a moving observer. The moving observer is the little device that is being spun around and causing interference. And now, that's said to be, it has to do with the rotation. However, I can blow that experiment up to the size of the galaxy. And just pretend, some benevolent aliens created it thousands and thousands of years ago. And that means that their little spaceship that's traveling through our part of the galaxy could be going at such a slow rate, that we could actually get on our own rocket ship and go jump on board as it's passing. But it'll seem to be going in basically a straight line because of the curvature of the galaxy is so small. So it's almost basically it's indistinguishable from a straight line. And what we'll end up finding is that the speed of the ship itself will be revealed by the interferometer experiment. In other words, it doesn't matter. The rotation is not related to radians per second. It's related to edge speed. And so that is how the Sagnac effect ends up working, is that it's directly related to that speed at the edge. So that's why you can blow it up to an arbitrarily large size and have basically a straight line experiment. And so there's a variety of ways in which the two-way speed of light has been shown to not be equal, and that there is a preferred frame, and but it's just not accepted. The explanations they start talking about relative simultaneity, and that's how all of these various experiments in the two-way experiment, the two-way speed of light, whenever there's one that seems to be successful, especially if it contradicts constancy, they instead say it's because of relative simultaneity. And which means that they're using the theory to prove the theory, and that's circular reasoning. And so that is actually something that is going on. But so all of these questions, I do have to produce value, right? That's kind of your part as an experimentalist. I'm saying there's lots of experiments. There's mountains of evidence that that light speed is not isotropic. That's my contention, and therefore that leads to the idea of a preferred frame, which we see with this cosmic microwave background. We see that there's a preferred frame in a variety of ways, and as a matter of fact, general relativity ends up coming out as a preferred frame theory. It is and there's about I think I've got 5 different quotes from Einstein that said we need to abandon constancy, and it's specifically like abandon constancy. So the question is, how is that valuable to us? How do we, if we have this, it's difficult to determine the two-way speed of light. Well, there are actually, I believe that there are devices that we could actually create, additional experiments we could create that rely upon a difference in the one-way speed of light. And specifically how those things come out is, first off, our idea of space-time and things like that, those are that's a metaphysics. In other words, our idea that space and time are linked and that we are simultaneous with a different place, that is a metaphysical interpretation without experimentation. The Minkowski space-time, that is, he proposed it, then he died, and everybody, and this was after Einstein initially kind of ridiculed him and said, now that the mathematicians have gotten a hold of the special theory of relativity, I don't understand it myself anymore. He said that about Minkowski's space-time idea. Then Minkowski died, and he adopted it because he was in Annalen Physik. Various students of Minkowski actually jumped on Einstein's case, and so there was actually a lot of social pressure to accept space-time. And so there's a whole political history behind why we chose one path over the other when there is no experiment that we've agreed upon differentiates them. But I'm saying actually there's lots of experiments that do differentiate them, and all in favor of an isotropic constancy. In other words, in favor of an idea of ether and a preferred frame. So producing something of value, there's first of all, there are devices, the technology that can be designed based upon this, two different directions two different speeds of light based upon direction, when it comes to like guided systems and stuff like that. So for instance, one of the ideas I have is based upon one of Michelson's experiments that, perhaps you could actually, instead of only measuring rotation with those devices, you could actually measure translation. And that it's supposed to be not possible. And I'm still not sure that my design will actually work. It's something I've thought through, but so there are real world applications. There are real world way I can say that there are things that will come out differently. In other words, when we expect an object to be a certain distance away, it can be wrong if we're judging light to be isotropic because of our tests of how it works. Especially when we're getting light directly from them and using things like the Doppler effect and a number of issues like that, because then there are issues with the Doppler effect. How does the Doppler effect work? In the idea of light, Doppler doesn't really have a mechanical basis. In sound, it has a perfectly obvious mechanical basis, and that is as you are hitting the medium, and causing the compressions and the disturbances from equilibrium, you do each one of them before they can escape, and they stack up. That makes the wavelength shorter. Or you're escaping from them and making the wavelength longer. That's a physical reasoning that has to do with your relationship to the medium. We don't actually have that physical explanation when you believe that waves can exist without a medium. And so the physical explanation actually has to rely more upon your angle through space-time. And there are a variety of issues with that I like to bring up, but that's neither here nor there. I'm trying to get to the point that I think that there really can be a experimental difference, but my problem is, how can I ever get anyone to do the work unless I, in other words, it's kind of like when you're first trying to get a job when you're first going, you have to have experience to get a job, and you have to have a job to get experience. And so it's the same kind of thing with this idea that's like, hey, this is worth investigation because we might be able to do something. But how do we get anybody to put in the work required to investigate if not everybody's really on board with this other one? It's like you have to be able to do all these things that prove there's a value, prove that it's rational, prove that it fits with experiment. And it's something that's been a project of mine to try to, it's up in the air. Sure, it has to be proven. Sure, it has to go through. Well, how do I get anybody to be interested?
Maybe I need you to do it yourself.
I've just designed an interferometer, but I actually have some friends. I'm gonna try to get them who are doing experiments. They're doing bell test experiments, so they have the equipment that's required to do bell test, which is a very very fine equipment. So I might be able to get to convince them to do my version of a one-way speed of light experiment. But if I do another version, because there's been multiple versions of a one-way speed of light experiment, and I'm already saying there are mountains of evidence to accept, including Einstein saying, abandon constancy, abandon constancy, abandon constancy. It doesn't work. If there is mountains of evidence that light travels one speed different than the other, yet the consensus opinion is different from the evidence, what good do I have in producing additional evidence that I believe they absolutely will not accept, no matter how it comes out, no matter how well the experiment is performed, because there's already experiments that already show that that the one-way speed of light is different. How do I overcome that?
How did they reject those experiments? What was the logic?
In each one, it's different. Well, in the ones having to do with those one-way speed of lights, typically it's an argument having to do with relative simultaneity. They're saying that the time is different in that place because it's in a different place in space-time, which is just, like I said, it's called special pleading, I think is what it's called, where you use your theory to prove your theory. Because of the disconnect, because a lot of people don't understand that relative simultaneity and constancy are one thing. They're not separate in any way. Trying to prove that and specifically isotropic constancy and relative simultaneity are one thing, because there is no relative simultaneity in the Lorentz Poincare Aether version. That is an illusion. It's there in the math, but it doesn't exist in reality.
So is the experiment that you have in mind, can you argue that it's not susceptible to the same criticism?
Perhaps, but I would argue that there's that Miller's fine work that he received a prize for, one of the most amazing scientific, it was life's work, and it being rejected is absolutely absurd. And the reasons by which it is rejected are one man's saying that it was a temperature effect, and he did multiple things to address temperature criticisms specifically, and showed how the systematic effect is completely different. And his work is irrefutable in my case. Yet people, even on Wikipedia, for instance, here's a good example of how much people treat science as a religion when they don't have a religion, especially. And that is on Wikipedia there was the Dayton Miller page. They have this, it is against Wikipedia rules to use self-published papers as part of the what's there. What's been on the Dayton Miller page for years now is something called the Roberts criticism, and it's based upon Fourier transform, and it is a self-publish. And I specifically struck it down because it's a self-publish, and they keep putting it back up and will not allow it to be taken down, even though that's against the rules of Wikipedia. And so there's these different things there where people protect their beliefs, and they because they are beliefs, because they are things that they hold to be dear to them, and so the criticisms, if you attempt to explain the context of the criticisms of the Dayton Miller, for instance, you will generally be attacked. I mean, I've actually been attacked and ridiculed and things like that just for daring to talk about something that's just historical fact. And so there is a sociological problem that people don't believe exists that does actually exist. And that's kind of something that I've faced for a long period of time. And that's one of the examples. There is a lot of evidence that you can go and put up all of this information about. For instance, there was a Nobel Prize winning economist who looked at Dayton Miller's data and found systematic effects that even Miller had not found, that were amazing. And even I think it may have even been related to like where a black hole was. There was an anomaly, and he did various types of analysis of the data. And an economist knows how to look at very complex interconnected data, and his analysis of it, that's something that people don't really know about either. And so there's just lots and lots of ways. Just the functioning of a ring laser gyroscope that every one of our telephones has one of them in it. I mean, we're using it constantly. Just that very function alone should indicate to people that the idea of one-way speed of light being constant, they should start to question it. They should start to say, wait a minute, that doesn't quite come out with what I'm seeing from what's occurring. Yet there was always a way in which, and this is something I experienced with like fundamentalist religion, when I was growing up, they would always have a way in which they could explain anything within their idiom, within their worldview, and so there's just kind of a difference of worldviews. And when you have a very strongly preferred worldview because it is very successful, for instance, current model is very successful for damn good reasons. It is. But when you want to talk about a subtle change, that's no longer okay to a lot of people. Now these aren't the real scientists like you. These aren't, these are the people who call upon you to fight with me. In other words, the you as an archetype. In other words, people have a type of arrogance by proxy. It's like people who will say that they're very humble, for instance, in their religion, will actually, because of they believe the religion to be right, will act very arrogantly towards people on behalf of their religion, on behalf of their group. And so there's an arrogance by proxy where they can have no personal belief in themselves, but still attack people on behalf of their group. And that's actually a lot of what occurs on behalf of real scientists who, like you, are not so certain. There's a subgroup just under you who are extremely certain, very, very, very certain. And they pretend to represent you.
Kruger, what's the name of the effect that where your confidence rises to a peak as you learn more, and then when you actually begin to know a significant amount, it starts coming back down.
Yeah, it goes down, and then there's a little rise back up. Dunning-Kruger is one of them. There's another one that's very similar, and I always forget which one it is. But yeah, I know what you're talking about. And that's but there is kind of a, it's why people watch sports and will riot when their team loses. They associate their self-worth with a group, and there is a defense of the group that people find in patriotism and Carl Sagan once said, it's like ration. I remember just a small quote of his, like it was just the way he presented it was great, where he was like appeals to rabid nationalism or no longer working. And, there's this, but the truth of the matter is, no, they're deeply part of humanity. Appeals to rabid nationalism and groupism, things like that, are deeply part of our instincts, and so people continue to do that and always will. It's kind of who we are, and we have to find a way to work around it. But anyway, I hope that I've been able to convey something interesting to you, and that you feel is might be worthy. In other words, it might. If I could just get a might, that's the best. Yeah.
I mean, it's a hard sell for the reasons that you've mentioned. And I don't know. I mean, you've pointed out some problems with cosmology and quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics certainly is a much more difficult subject than relativity, because it's so far from our experience. I mean, common sense. I've said this before. Common sense is equal to the picture of the world that you've built up from dealing with big, slow things, right? And we only interact with big, slow things. We don't have any perceivable interaction with atoms and photons and stuff like that. We don't have any perceivable interaction with galaxies, right? We all do that through abstractions and science and so on and so forth. So we have convictions about what must be true because it's obvious, right? If you throw a baseball out the front of your car, it goes faster than your car, right?
Right, ballistics.
If you throw it the other direction, it goes slower and so on, right? And you know how to add and subtract those velocities. It's all simple and makes perfect sense, and any idiot knows that, right?
Right.
The idea that should be wrong is patently absurd. Okay, because it violates common sense. And the idea that an electron should be in a state where it's in two places at once, that's ridiculous. That's patently absurd as well. But it's why do we trust our common sense? Well,
there is a balance between us.
Very limited experience that we base our common sense on.
I agree, but here's the thing. So there is the no magic rule of science. So like there is that is kind of the basis of how we diverge from religion, because let me say that what you're saying is an argument used in religion for thousands of years, and that is that God doesn't make sense and never will make sense. Don't try to make sense of it. And that is a religious argument, and that religious argument is what's used now to uphold anything that is broken in physics. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm very, very shy of that argument, and I've heard it many, many times, but I don't like it because there is a value to. I mean, right? I agree that right now my eyes have 2 points at which I am hallucinating those things. I don't actually see anything at these 2 points. There's nothing there. My brain's making it up. Because where the nerve is, in your eye, you actually have 2 blind spots. Your brain is making up a bunch of stuff that is just completely BS. And so why should we believe our intuitions? When you're talking about just gut feelings, absolutely, I agree with you. But there are certain things that have to do with whether or not the reality works or is a bunch of woo. In other words, is it all a bunch of disconnected, happens by magic that we just have to accept, the description? Well, accepting the description is what religion has asked us to do for many, many years. And truthfully, religious ideas did work for people in a certain way. There was a level of cohesion of society. There was a being able to continue on your path as a warrior, as a worker, as a whatever, and work within a society based upon that belief. But was it an accurate belief? may have been a useful belief without it being an accurate belief. But being able to abstract away and say, just believe it, you're good, move on. There's a value to that. But I believe that there is also a more important value to saying, no, I don't believe in magic. I don't believe in things that leave stuff unexplained. I refuse to not go down that why loop that children do. Then, in other words, I've been punished. Every child eventually gets punished for saying why. But that drive to regress down the path of how things work, that's science. That is our drive for science. We want to understand the way that the world works. And so there is if things have no reason for happening, then why do we believe any reason at all? There is a kind of a postmodernist feel to this idea of just accept it as it is, and it can be magic at the bottom, and it doesn't have to make sense to you. I don't think I think it has a level of accuracy I think it has a level of truth to it that, yeah, you should not just, believe in your gut feel. You should instead be seeing, but I think there is something beyond just gut feel. That whenever we say, oh, it doesn't work with your intuition, there is a level of that's kind of a plastering over various types of things that you can call intuition that shouldn't be called intuition, like the no magic rule. It is my intuition. I don't have any proof that I'm not a dolphin dreaming I'm a butterfly or whatever. I have an intuition that there is a reality, and that it works, and magic isn't real. I have an intuition there, and I think that intuition is extremely reasonable, and it's not the same as my intuition that humans are too small to affect the environment. That's not the same type of intuition. One is more about requiring that there be mechanics, and the other is, I don't know, I got this general feel.
Sort of more of an aesthetic commitment. I mean, this is something I describe to people a lot. I mean, the scientist believes that there's a real world that behaves in a real way, and it behaves the way it does, regardless of whether we think it should or whether we expect it to.
I agree with that.
There is this objectively real world, but there's absolutely no way you can prove that, right?
Exactly. So it has been extremely valuable to us, and it's never been broken, really.
Yeah, but it's an aesthetic.
Yeah, it is. I agree. And so I want to stay with that aesthetic. I want science to continue with that aesthetic. Right. I want it to continue to adhere to that and in a level of self-consistency, and I feel that it is not. I feel like it failed to adhere to that.
Let me tell you two stories. Story one. Person has a sick parent or something like that, and they go to the priest and they say, "What can I do?" And the priest says, "Well, my child, if you say enough prayers to God, then perhaps your parent or sister or whatever will get better," right? Mm-hmm. So they go try it, and two possibilities: either the parent or sister or whoever does get better, in which case they say it's real, or they don't, in which case, right.
They didn't pray hard enough.
It works in mysterious ways, right?
Right.
Here's another story. People are doing experiments on elementary particles back in the 60s. Okay. And they find these mesons that are heavier than pions, and they have strangeness. They have some property which is conserved, which they don't know what it is, and so they call it strangeness, right? And they say strong interactions conserves strangeness to first order, right? and they start cataloging all these different particles according to strangeness, right? And they say, and Murray Gell-Mann comes along and comes up with the eightfold way, and he says, according to my calculations, if you look at this energy with this kind of charge and mass, you should find a particle there which has strangeness -3. I call it the omega minus. Okay, Now, this is something nobody's ever seen anything like. This is all completely weird, right?
Right.
And people went and they did an experiment, and damned if there wasn't a particle there that had all the properties that he predicted, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's much weirder than praying, right?
Right.
But I mean, there's something convincing about that. Okay, that sort of thing. If somebody predicts that something totally bizarre is going to happen, and you go and do a measurement and it does happen, and you see it and it's real. Okay,
But that's different than a predicting that I don't know, that the world will end in 3 days or something. It's different because there is a mechanics to it. In other words, there is a when you have a mathematical model, there is a unbreakable set of self-consistency. There's a self-consistency where you can turn it all around and the relationships do not change. Right. And so because of these relationships, sometimes there is white space. In other words, that if I take this structure, stick this structure onto it, there's this white space between them that has to be a specific shape, period. If this one is right and this one is right, then that shape, when they're together, is something particular. That's not a prediction. That is an observation, kind of. In other words, it is an observation based upon the belief that there is a mechanical nature to reality. And that's really why math is so unreasonably effective at physics, is because of the fact that it is a supposition that reality is mechanical. And that is, I think that, like, a lot of times people say, reality is made out of math. I don't believe that. I think reality is mechanical in nature, and math is mechanical in nature. And it is this unbreakable gear-like interaction, between things that keeps them from having, you can't have three gears together and them spin. You can't put them together. It's just a mechanical way that things work together that is unbreakable and consistent. And that is how reality seems to always work in all cases, except for these tiny little places where we say, shut up and calculate. And
it's the steampunk talking.
It is definitely, but it's also based upon things that when we have an alternative explanation that works with determinism and works with mechanics and intuition and a simpler way of things, and we have one that is based upon things like observers and other kinds of silly ideas of randomness and stuff like that, why do we select one over the other? And that is an important part. Like, for instance, I brought up John Stuart Bell's quote about pilot wave. And let me, I don't know if I've ever shown you this video. It's really short. I'm going to share it real quick with you. And I think that you'll like it. If I can find the share screen button here. There it is. There. So let me put it in. Okay. I guess I need to hit it. I need to hit start on it. So whenever I'm talking about the Bush-Coudet experiments or the Walker experiments, I'm going to be quiet so you can read these things. So let's see. Okay, he's got a couple more slides here.
Oh, the quantum mechanics, the Schrodinger equation, it was really emerged from fluid mechanics originally.
Mm-hmm. It was from Louis de Broglie. I mean, in his original paper, he talks about de Broglie's explanation throughout it, through Schrodinger's, when he actually, the paper in which he introduced the Schrodinger equation.
It's not at all surprising that there's a repeating pattern. That is, you get similar patterns out of theories that have much in common.
Yeah. So the point is that so the thing that like Feynman said is that it is. If I could find that quote, maybe I could. Do I have that quote somewhere? I bet I do, but I'll just let it. I'll paraphrase. So Feynman said that there's one thing that is absolutely inexplicable, and that is the dual slit experiment. And this is the crux of our ideas behind wave particle duality, because it's not explicable in any normal mechanical way. It is responsible for all the weirdness in quantum mechanics. And we don't understand it, and we feel like we can't understand it because there's just no way of explaining why it is that it behaves this way. That is no longer true. That was true during his time. Now with these experiments, we have an alternate explanation of the dual slit experiment, how it is that something can behave as both a particle and a wave. And it's through de Broglie pilot wave mechanics. But the thing is, our ideas of pilot wave through Bohm, there was some confusion as Bohm attempted to extend it. And there was actually something called the de Broglie double solution that John Bush at MIT has been exploring. And that was back in 2012 they did this. Since then, there has been lots and lots of experiments where they have shown everything from tunneling, every type of quantum weirdness that we experience. There is now a mechanical explanation for in these, and a mechanical analog that if the exact same thing is happening at the atomic level, would be a mechanical deterministic method of explaining everything we see as weird in quantum mechanics.
It's always been true.
Yeah, it has been. But the thing is, nobody really realized that the idea of, like, for instance, the dual slit, where you have single electrons and they seem to be interfering like one electron, because people actually see them as a single like ball or an infinitely small point. Now it's up to a ball from an infinitely small point. But the places on the on the screen, even when you send them one at a time, it seems like it's interfering with itself. But with this explanation, it's just the wave field that it creates is traveling through both slits and interfering and causing the pattern that comes out the other side. And so there is a rational explanation that no longer relies upon things like the observer, no longer relies on any of
this business is completely bogus. There's no such requirement.
Yeah, well, exactly. But it's still
you can't. The electron can't decide what state it's going to go into without an observer. That's bullshit.
Yeah, it's complete bullshit. Right? Exactly. Thank you.
It has to have an interaction, right?
Yes. Yeah, I know. I agree with the interaction part. That there is an interesting aspect to interactions, and that is, like, one of the ways that I like to describe it is that there's thresholds. In other words, like, if something I can kind of describe without diagrams is say I have a bunch of those like Easter Island statues half submerged in the ocean, and then as waves come up, they almost knock all of them over. A wave comes up, goes against them, but they don't fall over. But if I were to like take those statues and make them like this, so that there's a bunch of them in a row, and I have one at the end. As the waves came in, they might actually add together until they got to just enough where the wave was high enough to knock over one statue. So the point here is that there are points at which a wave will bounce off instead of actually transfer its energy because of a transition point. And that's kind of like my real world explanation of how there are this idea of packets of energy and things like that can be seen as simply transition points where there's a minimum amount of energy required to knock over a statue. And once you traverse that, one statue is knocked over. And so our ideas of discreteness from continuity. Or they can be part of an interaction profile and it doesn't have to exist as a discrete entity, to have a discrete like effect when it interacts.
Yeah, I understand that the pilot wave interpretation is one of the ones that people love, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Because it is mechanical, right?
Yep.
It's easy to relate to, but it requires something like an ether, right?
Mm-hmm.
The pilot waves have to be waves in something, and it gets you right back to the same problem. And I understand that for some people it resolves an unacceptable confusion about how in the hell can an electron interfere with itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't bother me, right?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I understand that there is I
don't feel there's a problem.
Right. But what if there's a value where in having this additional model? Because the one thing I could say that if there is an ether, what if it is instead of in other words, the effects that we see in the vacuum in quantum mechanics of particles popping in and out of existence, what if instead of the randomness, that there actually is additional information available? In other words, there is instead of it being randomness causing this what appears to be random. In other words, like the motion of that droplet in the corral there appears to be random, but there is a deterministic, a complex but deterministic thing going on there. So that means, what if the vacuum actually has information in it? In other words, it is actually there are, for instance, what I've referred to as vortex filaments. So vortex filaments are something that automatically form in superfluids, and for all intents and purposes, the ether seems to behave like a superfluid or a supersolid, and so one of the natural outcomes are these vortex filaments that automatically arise in it. So if these things, when Maxwell's paper was called on Faraday's lines of force, and what if those lines of force actually are some structures that can be in space? What if those structures are actually real, and perhaps they are another way in which we may be able to gain more information about what the vacuum is doing, and thereby have some way that we can better manipulate the vacuum? So in other words, all of our issues of trying to, like, say we want to, have space travel and manipulate these fields in various ways, there are weird effects that we see in various experiments that we don't tend to believe, and we're like, well, what is going on there? It's got to be wrong. One of them was that the EM drive, where they found that in various labs, it's like, what on earth is going on here? And they repeated the experiment at various labs, and each of them had an effect. There's been some contention that maybe there's an explanation that fits with the current model, but there are other things like that where it's like, are we trying too hard to eliminate an effect we're seeing? Are we trying, like there was a effect from rotating superconductors that seemed to be have a gravity shielding effect, or some change. In other words, there was more change to gravity than there should have been based upon the rotation of superconductors. And so what if what's occurring, maybe there is something real there, and we just refuse to believe in the possibility because we cannot think of a model by which this could ever be true. In other words, there's no way that this could be true because there's nothing there. But what if there is something there that we're manipulating through, maybe the whole idea of like flux pinning is that there's vortex filaments that are being pinned into something, and then you're grabbing a hold of those filaments that are there and confining them to an area. What if that in confining them to an area, you're then able to better manipulate the ether? What if? And so there's a lot of what ifs that are fun for science fiction, but I think are also valuable. If this were to turn out true, we might find that there's a lot more information available. The same thing is true with by the way, with special relativity. if in the ether version of it, there's time dilation and length contraction, but according to the Lorentz, the relativistic ether, there would also be situations in which you would think that you would see time contraction and length dilation. In other words, whenever we're explaining what occurs, and you look at someone who's traveling, they should look time dilated and length contracted, and then you have the whole twins paradox, right? But the thing is, there is a resolution of the twins paradox in the Lorentz version, because the other person looks back at you, and if one of you is moving with respect to the ether and the other is not, then one of you is time dilated and length contracted, and the other is going to see the other one as time contracted and length dilated. And so there is so whenever you resolve the twins paradox, typically whenever you do that, you say, oh, well, it was the Earth because of the turnaround, and we draw a little, triangle or something as our way to describe which twin that we choose. But no matter what you do, doing that selects a preferred frame and basically reduces special relativity to Lorentz ether theory. And so each time that you do that, you are selecting a frame. And once you select a frame, instead of both of them seeing each other as time dilated, one of them gets the appearance that the other is time contracted, immediately, and people don't go to that next step.
So does that get rid of the twin paradox?
Absolutely, because it's only relative to your motion with respect to the ether that it's going to matter. In other words, but this is
the experiment we have to do is to do the twin paradox experiment.
Yeah, absolutely. But we're doing various ones like that, though, and so you have to consider. You have to take into consideration the idea of not a grid-like ether. It's not a coordinate system. It's like the ocean. There's tons of little eddies and currents and things like that. And one of the things that they find, for instance, in frame dragging, whenever you look around a star, the effect is basically the same as though the space-time is like a fluid being dragged along by the rotation of a black hole. And whenever they did a round the Earth Sagnac experiment where they found that as the satellites went around the Earth, they were able to detect some frame dragging around the Earth as well as the motion of the satellites. So there's all of these effects. I absolutely contest that there is mountains of evidence of a one-way speed of light in preferred frame physics, and I contest that that is what Einstein believed as well, and that we're continuing with special relativity's idea of isotropic light speed. We're just continuing a tradition that happened because Minkowski died, and that's it. That's the only reason we're continuing that, and that we would now have a variety of things that we could look at more closely if we simply accepted a fluid dynamical model of space-time, and that there's very, very little difference, but those little differences can make a big difference.
Well, if you could make the pilot wave model work with the ether, and recover a deterministic universe. And if you do that, then the issue of people would start arguing again about the issue of free will.
Who needs free will?
Here's my position on free will. I don't care.
I agree. There's
absolutely no effect of whether or not free will is real.
Well, I don't believe that our separation from the universe is real. We're just what the universe is doing.
And every one of us is going to continue to behave as if we thought it was real, no matter what we find out. If we find out tomorrow that it's absolutely false, it's a total illusion, it's not going to change anything. Okay,
yeah, that's true. I agree.
This is another one of those interpretation things.
Yeah, and that is one that I don't feel has any value. I think that's one of those places where I agree with you. There are certain interpretations that there's just nothing to do with it. It's fun. It may be interesting, but in the end, is there a scientific value to it? I don't know that there is. Is there something we can engineer based upon that? But I'm contesting that what I'm talking about, there is an engineering and invention a basis for why we would want to decide by experiment whether we should have gone a different direction instead of selecting without experiment one direction over the other.
Well, I mean, if you do an experiment that should yield a twin paradox and doesn't, then you've made a significant you've taken a good whack at special theory of relativity.
But the thing is, it's like I don't think that there is, really the special theory of relativity is mathematically it's correct. And it's just the metaphysics that I'm arguing. In other words, I'm really arguing that the metaphysics is going to cause us to extend it wrong, not that it's wrong. And that's the thing that I don't want anyone to say that that what I'm saying is that special relativity is wrong, because I'm saying that Lorentz ether theory and special relativity are mathematically equivalent in most cases. There are just these special edge cases, special extended applications where you get more information out of Lorentz ether theory. There is these, those shadow calculations where you're like, somebody is, length contracted and time dilation. You can look at the structure of special relativity and come up with the same thing because it's the same math. It is the same thing. It's just a different way of interpreting the numbers that you're looking at and what they map to. And so it's not really a blow against relativity, and that's why I want to just say relativity, because it's simply a blow against the metaphysics associated with relativity, and that's my issue, is that we believe that the metaphysics is the same as the mathematical theory, and it's not. There is these beliefs that we have about it that are just metaphysics. They're just opinion. They're just ideas, and they're not based in empiricism. And that is my central argument, that it's just not based in empiricism. And the truth of the matter is, we have discarded a tremendous amount of empirical data and decided it wasn't valid in some way or another because we wanted to believe this other version of reality. We wanted to believe there's no ether. We wanted to believe that space and time are conjoined, but we didn't have to, and we didn't have a reason to. And so we could have just accepted the fact that, Miller's data is correct. We could have accepted that the Senyek experiments and the effect actually do show that there is an anisotropy, that word. There is not isotropic space, that the speed of light is different. And understanding that what we see in the differences in time, like for instance, between satellites in orbit versus on the ground, well, that's a different speed of light. And Einstein talked about the variation in the speed of light and talking about how, well, you can't have constancy in a gravitational field, and there's a gravitational field everywhere, so you can't have constancy. And so it's like, why are we still talking about constancy? Why? It's because it's a sociological thing. And it's like, okay, then once you get people to say, okay, it's a sociological effect, then what's next? And that's what I'm hoping to do. It's like, there's that area of inquiry. There's this exciting science that we could dig into still. It's still there, ready for us to go and explore and find out if it's right, and it's just, I don't know, it's exciting to me.
Well, if you can think of an experiment that would make a distinction. I mean, if they're totally equivalent, then the metaphysics, I don't care.
But they're not. That's the thing. And and it's that isotropic versus anisotropic. And that is the proof between the two. And being able to create an experiment that people cannot self-delude them and use circular arguments with, that's not something you can do. In other words, you cannot use evidence to deal with religious behavior. Evidence and religious behavior are they're mutually exclusive. And so the people behave religiously about their group. And that is my problem, is that there is a large, even scientists are humans themselves, and they rely upon all the other humans that they're just barely below them as specialists. In other words, they're specialists, but they need all the other human knowledge that everyone else is using. So they are actually influenced by the group. So those people who are not the physicists actually do influence the physicists. And so there is this feedback loop between them.
Well,
and,
look,
and that is,
I've said this before, and I'll say it again now on tape, as it were, that what you say is true. Okay, people get attached to things, and they don't want to ever appear to be questioning things that everybody else doesn't question, and that's true. Scientists are like everybody else in that respect. But if you go to if you get a result that actually favors the ether theory over the STR, and shows that there is a difference, and it's not just a metaphysical difference, then please don't come to write your paper starting with the statement that the scientific community is taking a religious attitude to it. You know, I mean,
that's a sociological thing.
You're right. Even if you're right, mm-hmm. the extent to which you are right, all right, which to some extent you are, this is exactly the ubiquitous starting point in an argument with a crank, right?
Yes, I know. And there really are cranks that have absolutely no knowledge, no understanding. It's like, oh, and those people, and here's the thing, everyone like you hears anything from me, any bit of information. You know how long I had to sneak up on you? Any bit of information I have to give, and immediately crank recognition.
You're right. You do. Right. You do use that argument, okay, and it's a dangerous argument because it will make people stop listening.
I know. But the thing is, people will always, and that's why I've been having to play a dangerous game of charades and balance. And the only way you can defeat a sociological phenomenon is with rhetoric. It's not with evidence. And that's the biggest problem that science faces, in my opinion, is that there is a point at which evidence becomes irrelevant because of the trajectory of a belief system. And the evidence starts being discarded based upon the fact that it is an anomaly. An anomaly has to do with your idea of probability, which has to do with your limited data set, which is basically bullshit. And so we have these considerations where we start throwing away anomalies and finding ways in which to not look at evidence. And so how do you break that? How do you break through that? Because I've tried everything from I started out just asking questions. I got banned from like discussion boards for asking, like, completely. I was just curious. I just wanted to know, when I first got involved in it, and for asking the questions because they seemed like they might be questioning, relativity. I was banned, not even allowed to speak. This has happened multiple times where I've been I'm like, did this really happen? Is this occurring? I mean, this doesn't seem believable. Is this actually happening to me? And that happens much more than people understand. And it's so, yes, you're right. Coming at it from a perspective of an iconoclast or any of those things, I do not want to be recognized that way, because immediately what happens is you're turned off, because the truth of the matter is I look, prima facie, is that how that's pronounced? On the surface, I immediately, your pattern recognition say, another typical crank. That should be and that by good reason, by lots of evidence of lots of other people saying some things that sound similar to what I say. They immediately, because they just have some very topical information, and then they go with their gut. That's what's actually happening with cranks. But the thing is, here is this. I have a tremendous amount of evidence. I could go on, and I don't want to bother you with going on for hours and hours and hours talking about all the various experiments and exactly how they work. And, but I've done the work, and I still instantly get recognized as a crank the moment I say anything that even slightly contradicts a false idea of relativity. And that is the problem. That is the problem that is has been almost unsolvable. And it's like, how do you solve that? And the only way I've been able to find, showmanship, rhetoric.
Okay, but you just finished saying that it was a false idea. Okay, so you've made several comments that don't quite match up. One of the comments is that they're mathematically equivalent. Okay, it's just a metaphysical interpretation difference.
Okay.
Well, then it's not false, right?
Yes.
The metaphysics is different.
Okay. The
you have to approach things with the idea that other people's model is not stupid, and it's not a conspiracy to defraud the world. With, you know,
I definitely don't buy the conspiracy part of it. I never attribute to malice that which can adequately be explained as
stupidity.
Yeah. So there is a level of rhetoric I've gotten used to that is habitual, that is difficult if I go back and forth between groups. And I agree, you're absolutely right that coming at it from a perspective of this wrong is not ideal at all. It is sort of, I have purposefully cultivated a level of emotional engagement. Because the truth of the matter is, the first thing that happens is first they ignore you. In other words, people will ignore you unless you get under their skin and piss them off, and then they want to screw you up. Then they're gonna show you. But then once they are trying to show you, then they'll actually listen. And so I'm actually just using it.
But it's a contaminated engagement.
It is. You're right. But sometimes there are unsolvable problems where you have to have a job to get experience. You have to have experience to get a job. How do you get through those things that are mutually dependent like that? You know, how do you get there? Through small ways of finding a non-ideal path in. And that is what I've been attempting to do. It's definitely not ideal. You're absolutely right. But it seems to be the only way in. And that's my issue. It seems to be the only way is to do things the wrong way. And when I discovered that was, well, that's actually, I spent, a long time in neuroscience and figuring out, so what exactly is going on with people? Why is it they, are doing these things? I already told you about my experience with going through the neuroscience classes. And that's actually what brought me to this solution to the problem. Because I was like looking at, it's like, here, I believe there's already evidence. So if there's already evidence, then producing more evidence is pointless. If there's already volumes and volumes of evidence, if there's empirical evidence.
Well, there's present.
How do you fix that?
I mean, I agree. I understand. I mean, it's a very frustrating situation for you.
Yes, especially since I'm automatically a crank right off the bat. So I just accept it. Look at me. I'm a crazy man. Dressed up, silliness.
No, but you have persuaded me to listen to you and to engage with you.
Aha! I snuck up on you.
It after our first battle, I realized that you weren't stupid and you weren't ignorant, right?
Yes.
But
those are the first impressions, and I understand that.
I ever encountered that took this trajectory who wasn't an idiot, right?
And I know it's so frustrating because people are like, please don't agree with me. For God's sake, don't agree with me, please. There's certain people I don't want to agree with me, and they do. And so it's like,
if I were 30 years old, I might decide to invest a year of my life or something like that and going out and read all this stuff and learn about all this history, right? Mm-hmm. and make come to my own conclusions. But I'm 74 years old, and I'm not going to.
You've already made great advancements for science. You've already made your mark.
And moreover, I'm an experimentalist, so I mean the theorists wouldn't listen to me either.
Yeah. Oh, that's true.
Yeah, it's a problem.
Yeah. And hopefully what we're doing right now is that's my eventual goal. My final goal is really just to have some level of awareness that might get some money flowing towards people doing experiments and just exploring a different set of ideas. Because, people, there has been this, at least for a decade or more, people have been talking about the need for revolution in physics. That's actually been kind of something that people talk about, but it's, not like that. Oh no, not like that. And well, basically not like anything. And so I'm like, well, but here's something that's basically equivalent. Now, I mean, you're right. It sounds like I'm contradicting myself when I say it's equivalent, but it's not. And what I mean by that is there is, if you see math like a crystal and you see theory like light, then the angle of incidence is your theory. And what comes out the other side can be radically changed, even though the crystal is unchanged. And so, and that has to do with your, the way in which you investigate things. So even though when I talk about relative simultaneity being an illusion in a mathematical illusion in Lorentz, Poincare, relativistic ether, it is because there is that mathematical structure does come up, and explaining it. I mean, I've actually gone to great lengths to explain the difference between, how shortening of a coordinate system is different than shortening of objects. And there are all these small, subtle differences that still come out mathematically the same at most points. And so what I mean is there is a way in which it's a non-standard way of looking. You have to be able to look at it through the Lorentz Poincare perspective to be able to see a difference, because it is explained as this other thing in the other theory. In other words, there is this idea that there's your angle through space-time, and that's why there is this relative simultaneity. But that ends up coming out differently in Lorentz Poincare ether. There's this weird back and forth effect that's kind of like in the video that we shared, having to do with the one-way speed of light. There's this interesting thing. It's really neat to look at once you start just looking at the details of the numbers, how it comes out. It's like, oh, that is so cool. The way that it comes out and the way that it works out is just really neat. But but what it ends up meaning is there's so much overlap between them that it just comes down to very small. The only real difference is that light will be traveling faster in one direction than the other, and that light travels as a wave in a medium. And so therefore, light is variable and not constant. It is the idea that light is actually variable, but appears constant. And so that is, it is a interpretation, but there are numerical ways in which it differs. But do you see how it is still the same starting place? In other words, it's an extension of the theory that allows you to see that, the distance to a star, if you use this idea of special relativity, the distance to the star is going to appear to be one thing, whereas from the perspective of the Lorentz Poincare ether, it's going to be a different thing with the same results. And that I actually explained in that blog. And it does take a long, explanation of saying, why is it going to be different results? And the simplest way is just the way that the guy from Veritasium explained it. And that is, this is the simple way, and it leaves some details out. But it's just that if, let's say, light traveled double the speed in one direction and instantly went back, well, then our idea is it travels, there's two equal paths. So the distance is going to be changed because, traveling a distance of 100 at a speed of, 50 is going to take, I need to write things down instead of, this is not working. But the idea, I think if you watch the video, you'd see that it's the idea, if it goes 100% of the speed of light in one direction, but then instantly goes back, well, then we normally think of it as it didn't go instantly one direction and the other. It had to go the same speed in both ways. So the distance is going to be different from the starting point to the end. That's how things do come out differently in in an ether theory version. And so there will be distance differences, even though the average comes out the same. It's just like the average of the bullets outside your window. If I don't allow you to measure anything but the average, then you're going to get the same speed looking out there. But they're not the same speed, are they? One's going, really fast, the other one's going really slow, and using your time and all of that, all those complicated messing with your perspective. I've got you thinking that the speed of bullets is constant, but they're not. And so in that kind of perspective is completely different than space-time, because in space-time, light really is constant. It is because you're traveling through space that there is the constancy of light. The constancy of light is a comment more about the nature of the universe than it is about light. It is about it is the constancy of light in the fourth dimension. You absolutely, to have isotropic light speed, you have to have that space-time conjoinment. It cannot occur without that. It's one thing. And a lot of times I don't think people who've only topically looked at it really understand how much that is just one thing. It's not two separate things. The constancy of light isotropically and the angle through space-time and all of those effects, those are one single thing. So and whenever you look at, for instance, a Minkowski diagram, it actually forces you to see light as an isotropic constant and does not represent that idea of an isotropic constant. It is the specific diagrams force one perspective, and so there's a variety of things that are very interesting, but within the same math, meaning something else and having these additional information. It's like you get half the information with special relativity that is available in the ether version of relativity. The ether version of relativity has double the information. And so that's kind of and speaking of doubling, remember how Einstein predicted exactly double the gravitational effect on light that Newton did? I've always found that very interesting, that it was exactly double. So that's a neat little weirdness that I think is something worthy of looking at some point.
What? My eyes are starting to close.
I know. I'm sorry. We're actually getting close to the 4-hour point, so that's exactly what I was hoping to do.
This is about the longest conversation I've had in 20 years. But, there's a book I'd love to have you read and tell me what you think about it, because it's the most beautiful book about space-time that I've ever seen. It's wonderful, and it's really at a reasonable level too. It's called Spacetime Physics by Taylor and Wheeler.
Oh,
you ever seen it?
I haven't seen it, no. I stick with much older authors.
It's just a wonderful, wonderful book.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And it's, it starts at a level which is completely different from what most, relativity books start from.
Mm-hmm. At some point, if you have some questions that ever occur to you and things like that, I'd love to answer. If you like, you say, okay, well, what about this? This doesn't work, or any of those things occur to you at some point later on. If this kind of rattles around, because I hope that what I've done is just allowed you to look at things from a different perspective that's interesting and entertaining, and and then maybe thought provoking. But if you come up with things that are like, hey, wait a minute, this right here is nonsense. If you come up with those things, please let me know. I'd love to talk about them further at some point. But I'm really thankful that you came on, and I'm so happy that you at least were able to say that it's like, okay, maybe it's not completely nonsense. That is all I hope for right there.
I have no capacity to judge, shall we say.
I don't know about that. You have plenty of capacity to judge, but maybe there's some additional information that you'd have to check out first to make sure I'm not completely misrepresenting it or something like that. You certainly have the ability, but you may not have the ability to look up and see if I'm misrepresenting things or not.
Well, if you think of a measurement that could be made that it would clearly make a distinction that's not just metaphysical, then we should talk about that.
Well, then I will definitely, when I'm writing a long explanation of the basis for what's called a grazing incidence interferometer, and it's something I invented. I guess it was closer to 15 years ago now, and I'm going to try to put together a common sense explanation of exactly how it works, and it is specifically to test the one-way speed of light, and I think it should show that there's a one-way effect, but I'm not sure it's possible to ever break out of the self-referential loop where they say that relativity is right because relativity is right, when they say that, oh, well, that's just an effect of relative simultaneity, because that's their explanation for most of these experiments. And I don't think it's possible to break out of that. I think that any time that you show that there is a one-way effect, they will then explain that as relative simultaneity, because it is, in a certain way, you can represent it as relative simultaneity. In other words, you can reinterpret any result that shows that light speed is traveling a different speed in dependent upon direction. You can find a way to explain that as based upon relative simultaneity, and that's what a lot of the, if you ever want to look into it, it's the one-way speed of light on Wikipedia. They've got some of the explanations there, and it'll link you off to various things, and it can get a little bit cumbersome going through that stuff, but that's the main problem. I think this may overcome all the arguments, though, because it should be able to be turned around like a Michelson interferometer. Even though it is based upon one direction, it is one direction in any of those directions. So the change, if there is an ether wind, it should actually pick that up. So I think there's an experiment that could be done. Like I said, this is a novel interferometer design that I came up with a while back. And so maybe it'll work. And like I said, I've got some friends who might be willing to implement it, but I'll definitely send that off to you whenever I send it to them. It should be a long explanation and how it should work out and what basically a proposal for the experiment.
If you get the data, I'd be glad to make some suggestions about how to present it in order to get the right. In order to get a good hearing.
Yes, and part of it is don't present it to the way that I typically present things.
I've done this experiment. I got this result, and it must be wrong. Can you help me to try to understand what I've done wrong?
Yes, that's the way you got to present it, right? You can't be this blustery asshole going, you bastards are wrong, look.
Well, it doesn't usually work.
No, it doesn't. But it'll certainly get under people's get in their hair, under their skin. And that's actually kind of been you can tell that's kind of been the strategy that I've used a little bit, is to try to get people pissed off a little bit. And because I like using the same technique. Just to be a little bit of an asshole, and sometimes that's effective.
My kids hate me for it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and especially for talking this long. This is really great. I really appreciate it so much. I appreciate your insight. This has been a fantastic. I can't wait to edit this and put it up online. I hope people will really enjoy it, and maybe I can do more like this. Maybe other scientists will be like, maybe he isn't that bad of an asshole. Maybe I'll do an interview with him too.
Some other subjects sometime we can talk some more. This is fun.
Yeah, so much fun. I love talking to you, man. It's always been a joy.